good for now. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the technical meeting in docket number 210917, PURA Investigation into Medium and Heavy Duty Electric Vehicle Charging. We really appreciate you all coming in person today. My name is Julia Dumaine. I'm the Supervisor of Strategy and Operations. I'm sure many of you are looking at us, why are we sitting up here? For those of you that have come to roundtable style technical meetings before the authority previously, staff have sat up here to enable more seating up at the round table throughout the discussion and to accommodate microphones. So thank you all again for joining. Today's meeting will be facilitated by myself, Attorney Arthur Lefebvre, and Danielle Chalou. The three commissioners had pre-existing commitments, so this is the representation for today. We do have a court reporter with us today, as this is an official proceeding in front of the authority, but today's discussion is intended to be more informal and more of an open discussion that allows the authority to further refine the aspects of the proposed medium heavy-duty charging program, primarily rate structure, interconnection, and fleet advisory services. So today's agenda will begin with the EDC team's presentation on their responses to recent interrogatories. We will have time for questions on this presentation, and then we'll move to a roundtable discussion. So at that point, after the discussion, the presentation, we will ask roundtable participants, those that were self-specified as representing their organizations, to move up to the tables over here, and then I will help facilitate that conversation. So at this time, I will hand it off to the electric distribution companies.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? So thank you, PURA staff and stakeholders. It's been about 5 years, I think, since being in the building. So thanks for welcoming us back. My name is Kevin Bond. I'm the manager of Clean Energy Strategy at Eversource. I'm joined today by my colleague, Brian Morris, who is the manager of Clean Energy Policy at United Illuminating, and Mark Kolka, the manager of pricing from United Illuminating. Ed Davis, the director of rates at Eversource, will be joining us. So I'll make sure that the initial part of the presentation is long enough for him to get here. Yeah, it's on. I'm sorry. It's just kind of off to the side here. Maybe, yeah, we'll move over a little bit. Is that better? Fantastic. So again, thanks for having us. We can get right into it, I think. So the agenda for our presentation is pretty straightforward. We're just going to take the a little deeper dive into the interrogatory responses that we provided, and we'll take them in order. The first one being CAE 81, which was generally about load management solutions and their applications to medium and heavy duty electrification. And then secondly, the response to CAE 84, which was generally about proposed rates in this docket and their application to various fleet needs. So we can get into the first one. So we presented our response to this interrogatory with this chart, which we reproduce here in the presentation. And as we were, putting together our response, we started to get stuck a little bit because of the various ways some of these technologies are defined in different jurisdictions or by different stakeholders, and what they're really used for. So we just wanted to get ourselves grounded in what our definitions are for these various, phrases of what these technologies are, what they're primarily used for, and then get into a little bit of some of the implementation implications of using them for medium and heavy duty fleets. So they're arranged in sort of grouping by their primary use case. So first up would be managed charging and off-peak charging incentives. We kind of group those together. Generally used for load shifting. And so the way CAE 81 was kind of phrased was more about how these technologies are applied to addressing system capacity constraints. But we felt like, when we're defining these solutions, what they're used for, we really want to highlight what the primary use case. The primary use case for managed charging isn't really addressing system capacity constraints. It's really for addressing peak load and load shifting. So to change a customer's behavior to get the load off of peak times. It's a well understood and applied solution on the light duty side of things. It's not so well understood or implemented on the medium and heavy duty side of things. It's designed to make sure that customers have the ability to shift their load to off peak. But their ability to do that on the fleet side depends on the individual fleet charging profile. Typically, an individual or a light duty vehicle is far more discretionary, especially a personal light duty vehicle. Your use of your car is far more discretionary than a fleet who's using it for business purposes and on a defined schedule, especially fleets who are wanting to maximize the use of their asset and use it as much as possible to get as much business done with it as they can. Our experience with, and I think this applies to both companies, but our experience with managed charging for fleets is extremely limited, and it's limited to light duty fleets. I think we've only just begun to pilot managed charging with 2 light duty fleets, and that's just the beginning stages. So we really don't have experience doing this and don't have experience at all implementing managed charging with medium and heavy duty fleets. And we're not aware of it being done on any large scale in any other jurisdiction. Next is storage and storage plus generation. So we define this as using a battery or battery paired with solar to provide non-grid power during peak hours. So again, here, I think the primary use case is load shifting. You could argue that a customer could use these technologies to address system constraints, but more often than not, that's not how it's being used today. Some of the challenges with this type of solution are that it requires adequate footprint on the customer site to be implemented. It by definition increases the cost of a fleet deployment because you're installing a whole nother technology on top of the technologies that you're already implementing for a fleet. And I think, when I said that the primary use case is load shifting, it's really enabling peak load shifting and enabling demand charge mitigation. It also can be used in a couple of different ways. So you could have a standalone battery. You could have a battery that's integrated into an EV charger. The battery could be used specifically for the fleet load, or it could be used for a variety of different things, whether that's building load or feeding power back to the grid. So how a customer uses this technology in relation to their fleet use, I think is up to the customer, and there's a lot of different configurations you could take advantage of. But generally, this is how we understood the solution at Davis. Next slide, please. Here is where we really wanted to address the definitions. I remember when we were discussing energy management systems in our Massachusetts proceedings a couple of years ago, everything was EMS. They defined batteries as EMS. They defined power sharing, EVSE modules as EMS. Everything was EMS. So we wanted to just really get down to the definitions, especially for these two. Because these two technologies definitely are designed primarily to address system capacity issues. The way the companies understand automated load management, is more on the customer side, right? So automated load management typically is either hardware, like a power sharing module sold with an EVSE, or software embedded on the EVSE that limits the output or balances the output of the overall system installation. And what I mean by that is that, for example, if you had two megawatt capacity chargers, so that's a total of 2 megawatts of capacity, but you limited them to their total output was 1 megawatt. So one truck could pull up at one charger and charge at the full amount, or two trucks could pull up and charge at half the amount of the rated capacity of the charger. This is a readily available technology with many EVSE providers enabled to either buy the hardware installation or software embedded on the in the charger, and it's fully permissible by National Electric Code to be able to do this when the installed capacity is greater than the capacity available on the system. Again, we don't have any experience with this on the medium and heavy duty side, but certainly customers installing, say, public charging have done this with their systems. There's plenty of examples of power sharing blocks installed with EVSE that potentially limit the output of the full system. So it enables a customer to install more ports than they're able to get from the power on the grid for various reasons. The energy management system. So we define this more as the system operator controlling the total output. So where the automated load management is more customer controlled, energy management systems more system operator controlled. It's typically associated with a full customer site load. But what I mean by that is controls the HVAC, HVAC on the building, controls other parts of the building. It's not typically, nothing is typically associated with medium and heavy duty fleet installations because there aren't very many of them, right? So the companies, not just our companies, but companies across the country don't have much experience with any of these technologies being installed with medium and heavy duty fleets. But that is to say, this is more on the system operator side, but acts in a similar way to automated load management. So the end result is generally the same as automated load management. We highlighted a couple of the implementation challenges. Mostly it's ensuring real-time balancing of loads below a certain level might be difficult based on the fleet's operating profile. But I think that's common across all these technologies as we're talking about them. So we'll pass it off to Brian.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Next slide, please. So good morning, everybody. So I'm going to take us through these last two load management solutions, and then I'll close with a couple of takeaways before passing it off to my rates colleagues to talk us through our joint responses to CAE 84. So flexible interconnection is basically where the utility company has the ability to limit how much capacity is available to an interconnecting customer based on real-time grid constraints. So I'll give an example to sort of help illustrate how this might work in practice. So let's say we've got a fleet customer that wants to enable 5 megawatts of EV charging at a location. And there's an interconnection study completed, and it's determined that to enable that 5 megawatts, it's going to take substation upgrades that require a couple of years of work. So under a flexible interconnection arrangement, that customer might be able to access 5 megawatts at certain times of the year, may be limited during other times to 1 megawatt or 2 megawatts, depending upon real-time grid constraints at that location. So we think of this not necessarily as a replacement for the need to do distribution system upgrades, but as a bridging solution to help get that customer electrified, potentially in advance of the full build-out of the distribution system. There are a lot of challenges and complexities that come with this type of solution. So there are a number of technologies that have to be implemented and integrated and all be able to communicate with each other to make this happen. So theoretically, you'd have the utility DERMS, which would be responsible for the forecasting and the allocating of how much power that particular site can draw. You'd have an on-site SCADA responsible for monitoring the power being drawn at that location to ensure that it's within the parameters that were established by the DERMS. And you'd have power management software solutions installed on the customer site that can communicate with the DERMS to make sure that it's operationalizing within the boundaries of the DERMS. So a lot of complexities here. All this has to be automated, and that's really what creates some of the challenges in standing up some of these solutions. The customer would have to agree to some decreased level of operational flexibility. So obviously, in a perfect world, in the example that I gave, the customer would have access to the full 5 megawatts of power on day one. Under this type of construct, they wouldn't. And so they'd either have to figure out how to operationalize within those boundaries or potentially install something else, let's say a battery, to help sort of bridge that gap. We are very early stage with this technology. There aren't any national standards for certifying or testing a lot of this equipment. And so it's really up to the utility companies across different jurisdictions to figure out how to implement these solutions, but also maintaining the safety of their grid. And on that safety point as well, it's important to build in contingency measures in the event that the communication fails between the DERMS and the site, making sure that the safety of the system isn't compromised. So I'll move on to vehicle to grid. We think of this more as V2X. It could be the grid, it could be a building, it could be a house. Basically, it refers to the battery of the vehicle being used for some purpose other than its intended purpose of operating a vehicle. So for vehicle to grid, if the fleet customer can use their battery to provide grid services, they could potentially monetize that service if there's a market established for it. Vehicle to building, if there's a building located at the site where the charging takes place, leveraging the battery for resiliency benefits in the event of a power outage. But there are challenges here as well. The charging stations that are installed have to be capable of bidirectional power flow. Those chargers are generally more expensive than charging stations that enable the traditional one-way power flow. And then if the vehicle's battery is being used, let's say to provide grid services, and then it has to be recharged so the vehicle can operate, that new time of recharging might create new grid issues that weren't necessarily foreseen when the battery was being leveraged as a DER resource. Next slide, please. So just a few kind of takeaways with our response here. And Kevin touched on a lot of this. So it's really important to have sort of shared definitions. There aren't many industry established and accepted, universally accepted definitions for some of these terms. So for example, energy management systems, that means different things to different people. So I think when we have these conversations, it's really important to articulate and specify exactly what it is that we're talking about to make sure that all the folks involved in the conversation are on the same page. Kevin also touched on the primary use case or purpose of each solution. The question was really getting at how these solutions can be used to address system capacity constraints, but there could be cases where a fleet customer might be motivated to pursue some of these solutions regardless of if it was incentivized through a program. So for example, utilizing a battery to mitigate demand charges, right? That math may pencil out where their savings on their monthly electric bill might yield a pretty quick payback period. And that customer might choose to pursue that solution even if it isn't an eligible incentive through a program. There really isn't any wide scale sort of, broad-based programmatic offerings to point to in any jurisdiction for some of these solutions. We're very much in the early days. So even, I'll point to California, who typically is sort of on the leading edge when it comes to a lot of these innovative technologies. Specific to flexible interconnection, PG&E just launched it's called their Flex Connect pilot program. That just launched back in October. When they operationalized their first small subset of customers. Still very early days. They're starting to learn all that it takes to stand up some of these systems. And they'll continue to learn. And the hope is that that program will potentially be scalable to more customers, but it's just too soon to tell at this point. But I do want to reiterate both UI and Eversource's willingness to potentially pilot some of these solutions, whether it's through the load management technology incentive proposal that we've discussed previously in this docket, or as I think we might have made reference to in our response to one of the interrogatories, leveraging the Innovative Energy Solutions docket with sort of that established kind of governance structure and process to potentially house a pilot that might result from this proceeding. So thank you. Happy to, after this presentation, happy to take some questions. But for now, I'll pass it off to my colleagues, Mr. Davis and Mr. Kolka.
Morning. Apologize in advance for my rough voice today. So I think the prompt we have today for this presentation, this slide, is around our response to question CAE 84, which addresses comments provided and a series of questions related to the Connecticut Green Bank, and particularly Highland and Zoom comments that were provided. My slide today really is just sort of a thumbnail of the topics that I think are addressed in detail in each company's responses. And we're glad to dig into any details you'd like. I think particularly one thing that stands out, and it's an observation on my point, that the nature of the questions seem to reflect maybe a misunderstanding of how our scenario one rate design has been designed. And how it works. So glad to discuss that further. Pardon me. But the key thing there is that our load factor, it's a sliding scale load factor rate design. And the questions are really around how does that design address the questions and comments that were received. So fundamentally, the questions were founded on, I think, a lot of assumptions. We don't have any data. Unlike, for example, we worked with the Connecticut DOT extensively with their data. We had a couple iterations of working with that information to better display and understand how the customer wants to operate and how the rate works in that context. I think that was a satisfying outcome here. We just don't have any detailed data or use cases necessarily that we had to work with. But our comments really are around how we envision this can work. And I think it's a very well-designed rate and does address the issues that were raised. I think as far as the rate predictability and stability and even the load factor bullet points here, we designed this rate based on an average monthly load factor. So it imputes all the seasonality that might might occur through, month to month or month throughout the year, but is a fixed structure. It ties to a customer's actual expected and then actual operation characteristics. It incorporates really a blend of what I would say would be the best practices or rate designs that are out there. We base it on the Rocky Mountain Institute evaluation of all the different rate designs, and particularly for DC fast charging applications, trying to blend all the components of rates and come up with this sliding scale, time differentiated rate structure. So it does address the load factor issue. It does provide rate predictability and stability. It provides a great amount of flexibility and clear price signals that customers can understand and react to and plan for. So the idea of cost forecasting, when you have a known structure and each customer has to look at their own operations to understand the impacts to them, and how they can operate in response to that. And operations will vary. It's up to each individual customer, but it's also up to individual circumstances. I would just say to my earlier comment that the rate is structured, it's set, it provides variability on a time of use basis. It addresses the demand charge barrier. It addresses the need for customers, especially in an early market, who may not know how they're going to operate. Very certain structure. It is effectively a discounted rate compared to the otherwise applicable rate. And it works really in a whole range of operating conditions for each customer. There's details in the question. I'm glad to get into any of the comments that we've made in our responses. I would say there's a lot of almost identical sort of forms of responses for each company, but at the same time, we have some unique differences among our companies, mostly around our costs and where we are in our current rate structures and how those apply to this methodology. Trying to think the other comment I wanted to make here. Okay, so there was one question, and I think there's always seems to be even the 2 years plus running for developing these kinds of rates, a look out there, what's out there. And I had mentioned the Rocky Mountain Institute, which synthesized a lot of the best practices or rates that were in effect, pretty much in other jurisdictions where maybe EV deployment is further along than where we are. But there was one pointed question on a national grid rate design. It's very similar to the Eversource and Unitil rate designs in Massachusetts. But I went into pretty heavy detail to analyze and look at that rate design. And there's many of the same elements with that particular rate design that we see not only in the scenario one rate design, but also in many of the other rates that I've seen around the country that are in service. The key thing I think really notable, we've designed our rates. Each company has designed their rates based on their otherwise applicable rate structure at a class average load factor. The national grid rate actually squeezes that down to only up to 15%. So we have a broader range. It's really based on our specific rates. And I would say that effectively, any given customer, whether you're a small, medium, or large ESB in this case, that you could look at if you wanted to just compare, but you'll see the same general structure, no time of use characteristics, but for the larger ones where they have a time of day demand, a billing demand, and it applies to only to their distribution component actually. So there's two key points I want to make is that we designed this to the class average load factor, so you get a deeper discount at the lower load factors. You still get all the dynamics of the demand and time varying rates, for the volumetric rates. What's not clear, the prompt we had on that other rate class was that if you get a discounted demand charge in a national grid rate, and this is true for the Eversource equivalent, and I'll just leave it there, you still have an offsetting volumetric rate. Okay, so you're not, and the same thing is true for our rate design in scenario one. If you discount the demand charge, you replace that on a revenue neutral basis with a volumetric rate. We've done that for 4 rate components. not just distribution, but distribution, transmission, and we have two other tracking mechanisms. So anywhere we have a demand charge, we've basically reduced the demand charge, increased the volumetric rate. It's time varying. They're all cost reflective rates on top of that. So, there's a question about the time periods that are applied here. We have a 12 to 8 time period, and we've costed everything out on that basis. The rate designs are going to be, so that gives you the fixed structure. And if you're, for example, looking at an ESB application, and a lot of the comments address questions like, well, we want to charge some of our fleet during the middle of the day. There are even comments about, a third peak, super off peak. But at the end of the day, we have cost reflective rates that are time varying. They're fixed and stable where you can look at that and understand how the rate works and be able to manage and, operate your fleet in accordance. I think there's some details that, if you want to get into, we can, but as far as claims on what the load factor impacts are, it's just a matter of just better understanding what our design does, and I'm not sure that's fully reflected in the comments that we were responding to. But as far as alternate rate designs, looking at that National Grid design, it's only designed to a 15% load factor. We have a roughly, I forget the numbers I put in the response, but it was kind of like you're only paying 30% of the demand charge as opposed to at 15%, it's 100%. For the National Grid example that was cited. There are volumetric rates that are much higher than, especially at the lower load factors, and they're not time differentiated. So those are some key features and characteristics that I think any customer needs to understand so they can understand what the impacts are. But if you're given a stable fixed rate structure, even within that, you'll note, and I'll note that prices that make up those rates, you got a structure, but the prices will change otherwise. For example, during the year for CLMP, there's a volumetric rate for energy supply. And if you're buying energy supply from the company, there are monthly changes to those rates. So there's a seasonality factor intrinsic to that rate already, and that's a very large component of the bill. So, you'll know what those rates are in advance. You might go to a competitive supplier, you might have alternatives, but, there's a seasonality there. There's the time of use characteristic. For two of those demand charges, it's a huge peak rate and a very small, if not zero, off peak rate for the demand charge, and that's quite significant. There are large price differentials built into these rate designs. So those all fit kind of state policy and, what's approved in the current rate. This rate is in effect for our light duty fleets. We believe it's a very flexible and viable solution. It does address all in one way or another, addresses all of the comments that we were asked to respond to. Beyond that, maybe Mr. Kolk, I don't know if you have anything you want to add or highlight at this point.
I think Mr. Davis hit all the important points there. We believe this is a pretty robust rate structure that solves a lot of the problems that were identified. And maybe the rate structures aren't understood completely. And if we wanted to, in this session, go through a little more about the exact details of how the tariff works. But without actual data, we can't apply this to real bills. So we can't estimate exactly what will happen on someone's bill. So operating data, which may not exist, but if there could be simulated data to help us do bill impacts, that's a big help to have when designing something like this.
So we stand ready to answer questions or engage. I will comment. We have, I mentioned the iterations with Connecticut DOT, and I think that was really helpful. Is the actual data use cases. It sometimes takes a little more time than a session like this, but we can do our best here to try to address quantitative questions.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation. I will turn it to authority staff for questions.
Hello, my name's Arthur LaFave. I'm an attorney with Pure Adjudications. Thank you for that presentation. Laura, if we could go back to the authority slides and go to the rate design slide. Yes, one more. Thank you. So, to start, I just want to set the stage for how CIE 84 came about. So in summary, there's been general support for the program to offer multiple rate structures to meet unique medium heavy duty fleet needs, and for a rate structure to be offered specifically designed to align with the operational realities of electric school buses. There's a concern from many of the comments that we've received over the course of this proceeding that there may be no one-size-fits-all rate design structure for medium heavy-duty fleet operators given the many different fleet use cases. On the other hand, as the EDCs explained in their presentation, they have responded to interrogatory CAE 84 to many of the school bus operators' concerns, explaining why they believe scenario one is appropriate for electric school buses. The authority appreciates the EDC's efforts to clarify some of these potential misunderstandings of scenario one. But my goal with my questions today is going to be to try to get to that potential issue that you brought up, that are these conflicting views simply due to a misunderstanding of scenario one, or rather a misunderstanding of the issues the school bus operators and school districts are facing? So at first, I'm going to direct my questions to Connecticut Green Bank, but I welcome others to either react to their responses or react to my questions themselves. I think I'm going to cover some of the main points that the EDCs have covered in their interrogatory responses in their presentation today. So first, on this slide, you see two highlights from Zoom and Highlands written comment responses that Connecticut Green Bank responded with in the last written comment set. And so Zoom stated that school buses typically operate on fixed schedules with long idle periods, which may result in lower load factors. Scenario one structure, which they see as penalizing low load factors with higher kilowatt hour distribution charges, could disadvantage electric school bus operations in their view. And we've heard today, so I won't repeat the EDC's response to that. But directing this to Connecticut Green Bank to respond, after hearing the EDC's response, do you believe that the higher kilowatt hour time of use volumetric rates negate the benefit of a discount to the demand charge for electric school buses? Or does that discount to the demand charge ease concern that scenario one may penalize low load factors?
Good morning. My name is Sarah Harari. I'm the Director of Innovation at the Connecticut Green Bank, and I'm joined today by my colleague Kevin Moss, who's the Senior Manager of Clean Transportation. I'll take a pass at it, and then I'll turn it over to Kevin to add any comments. So we provided testimony from Zoom and Highland with our previous filings, and I think it's worth noting that Zoom and Highland are somewhat unique in the operators that we've engaged with. They are both startups that are very focused on electrification as a service and therefore are very actively thinking about the rate structures. Are they able to use V2G to monetize those assets as the utilities presented versus the majority of school bus operators in the state who tend to be in the early stages of transitioning their fleets over and therefore have a very different understanding of rates and the rate and the impacts that rates will have on the cost of operating. In our testimony this time, we provided evidence from DATCO, who is a local school bus operator. They have an electric school bus that they are operating here in Connecticut, and they were quite surprised by the rates that they were charged this past year for operating that vehicle. And I would ask our utility colleagues if perhaps that can be sort of the start of the evidence or actual deployment data that we might have here in the state. I know that we have a few electric school buses already operating here in the state that maybe could serve as sort of a basis for a more specific analysis of what the impact would be from shifting from the existing class that they're in into the proposed scenario one as an illustrative example. But to address your specific question, I'll turn over to my colleague Kevin to see if he has anything to add.
Sure. I would just add that I don't think we can speak on behalf of Zoom in terms of their endorsement of what the EDCs have provided today. But what I can share is that based on the total cost of ownership analyses we've previously run, is that the scenario one average rates, broken out by load factor and the mix of demand charge and volumetric charge is can essentially lead to economical operation of electric school buses, one including vehicle incentives as well. But that the current rates that we're seeing from the DATCO bills that we forwarded along do not lead to economic operation of electric school buses. So I think that Green Bank is comfortable with the projections and data that have been provided with the scenario one rate, but we did want to provide the Zoom and Highland perspectives as an additional data point in our previous filings.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very helpful. Give me one moment. Okay, so, and I have further slides that go more into how we may acquire data to run simulations similar to how the EDCs did for Connecticut DOT. So I appreciate your comment, but I'm gonna get back to that in a couple of slides. I want to hammer a little bit more into the volumetric rates. So I had one more question here, but you may have already answered it. That Connecticut Green Bank is comfortable with the projections of scenario one, but my question was, does the shift to volumetric rates at low load factors address the school bus operators' recommendation to have seasonal rates? Since if the buses are not used much in the summer, the volumetric rates are going to be based on low usage. I know you said you can't speak on behalf of Zoom, but maybe speak to if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Like I said, can't speak on behalf of Zoom or Highland. I would just say that I don't think we want to discount their summer operations too much. I think more and more these companies are trying to stay active in the summer with various forms of service, which could be still using the electric school buses, but not principally for school transportation services. So there may still be kind of usage and load factor data that's coming in those months. But on an average basis, I don't know how much that would necessarily shift like the overall data profile for the year that the next year's rate is based on. What I would say generally is that as we were prepping for the session, we were really interested in sort of how the first year load factor tariff will be assigned based on that sort of like year zero data. If like, for example, if an electric school bus fleet is only operational for a few months and then they get on the new scenario one rate, or if, for example, they're converting a previously very underdeveloped school bus yard that only had a little bit of electric service, or if they were at a school itself that has a pretty large electric usage and larger load factor as well. I think that we're principally interested in how that first year of which, load factor set they're going to be on, and just essentially how that will affect their costs for the first year. Understanding that in a lot of the conversations that we've had with schools and school bus operators, that they're under a lot of sort of operational and cost control pressure in that first year. So I think that's something that we're particularly interested in exploring.
I have one more question related to the concerns regarding possible negative impacts that school bus operators brought up with potential low load factors. And then maybe we'll go back to the EDCs to see if they have any comments based on Green Bank's responses. So I also put up here that Highland stated that scenario one incentivizes higher load factors and promotes flat hourly charging for as many hours as possible. But because these school buses are plugged in for upwards of 17 hours a day, the most effective way to increase load factor would be to ensure the buses are charged at equal hourly rate for every hour it's plugged in, which incentivizes charging during on-peak periods. So my question was, after hearing the EDC's response, does Connecticut Green Bank believe that scenario one incentivizes electric school buses to charge on peak as Highland opined? Or do the differentials between on-peak and off-peak volumetric rates give enough of a signal?
I think that we have a better understanding of what the average costs are based on the specific load factor tier that's being used versus the on-peak and off-peak. I think we would want to turn to the EDCs to try and provide any sort of cost projections they could of the potential gain or cost savings that could be realized with fully off-peak charging.
Okay. I'll turn it over to EDCs to see if they have any comments before I move on to the next issue, but also just keeping in mind, I'm gonna get to the issue of acquiring data to run simulations. So just pausing to see if you have any comments based on their responses.
I will admit I had to read when I first saw those comments a number of times because it was a little frustrating to try to understand the claim of incentivization, particularly load factors. And then I think actually just now clicked on if the reality is that school buses are going to be plugged in for 17 hours a day or all day, it's inevitable that you're going to be charging during whatever defined on-peak period you have. That aside, I never thought of it as incentivizing higher load factors so much as the load factor was used to help provide that exchange of reducing the demand charge, increasing the volumetric, and of course, when you split it up into time periods, you're going to have different rates. So there's a tension between moving, addressing the demand charge at the lower load factors and of course also the time period, but also the load factor itself and also setting those volumetric rates. Now, I highlighted earlier that there are not just distribution, but also the other three demand components of rates. And we've done that respectively for each of those four components based on their cost characteristics. So I do think, and maybe this is more lessons learned from, again, I mentioned the Connecticut DOT, but just looking at actual operations and the ability to manage to that, all of those structures and pricing at various load factors of demand and energy, time of use based, provides known information where one could take a look at that and optimize when you charge, what brings the lowest cost. But if the reality is you need to charge at certain times, rates are designed to be cost reflective. And while it may be that's the cost of service to provide rates, they are at the lower load factors discounted compared to the otherwise applicable rate overall, if you do the weighted average effect. But I think you just need to look at, if I make an assumption of operations, I overlay the rate structure on that, and I say, what could I do differently? How can I manage that? I think that was our experience in talking with DOT. Obviously, larger fleet, but even at the early stages, when you're looking at the first few, in that case, buses are here, same thing. I think that's where you need to start to look at the actual facts. That DATCO situation, I understand, was based on general service rate, a full rate, as opposed to this scenario one. So to me, I would say if that customer load was, we get the characteristics of that, and you look at how does scenario one work? What did they actually experience? How was that load factor determined? And I know you mentioned there's the early stage and then the more stable. So that first year, that transition when you're starting up, plus it's a new rate, it's a whole new experience here. So talking through how we determine load factor, that's built into the design, and also what happens during that first year, and then what happens after that. If operations grow, you start converting more buses, for example. You've got all these transitional elements at the beginning. So I would suggest taking even a simulation of a particular period. And here's what I think my operating characteristics might be. And do you have that flexibility to manage differently, given the pricing that these rates expose you to? That's that. If you have the ability and you can manage it differently, it's probably still going to vary by month. Certainly, seasonal is, a way to describe it as well, but even day to day. So I think that's what I was alluding to earlier about, to get better insight and to help answer that question. I think you need to run those simulations, try to make them as realistic as possible, and also recognize this may present more options, how to do things differently. Beyond that, it kind of gets quite analytical. You have to really drill down into quite a bit of data. So I don't know if that helps, but we really, we spend a lot of time on this to try to understand the concerns, but also recognize, well, maybe there's just also being a new rate, not enough understanding of how it would be applied. So if you have an example like the DATCO experience, you have some actual data, we could say, well, what would that be under scenario one? What would the load factor be? What are the rate structures then? Whatever tier you are, and what are your plans to change going forward? If that's the way it is, that you just have a certain number of vehicles that'll be charging, and that's going to be the case going forward, how can you better manage just that set of vehicles? So it's kind of like forecasting your load, forecasting your needs, and then how electric vehicles are a little different in terms of their ability to be managed and charged at different ways, but you're really just designing these for the actual operations and striking a balance between what the customer needs, how we can present a rate that still, takes care of the cost of providing service, but also provides, this is really a first generation rate, really. It could be that we learn other things, as we get more capabilities down the road. You've heard about, needing AMI to be able to do a more advanced rate design, learning about the data, gathering the data, looking at it, and seeing if there might be some other variation on this going forward. I think we're one of the areas of the country where we're exploring this a little more further than there's other pockets of the country have done, more ahead of us on this, but not many. And I think we can learn a lot from this, while at the same time providing some value through a rate design like this. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. And I think Laura, if you can go to the next slide. This is a good transition to I think maybe we can get to the next vehicle.
Use case. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I'm Jim Ruggiansky, the team leader of Connecticut Land and Resource.
Oh, you might need.
Yeah, we might need
Let me get over here.
And you're over to the real expert here.
So regarding, sure, I'm Jim Ruggiansky. I'm the team leader of Connecticut Rates for Eversource. And I spoke directly with DETCO within the last few weeks. They actually reached out to Eversource. Their Middletown operation has been in business or a separate service for about 4 months now. And after, after I, having a long conversation with them, realizing that, they're not eligible for a light duty rate, buses are medium to heavy duty, there's an ongoing hearing and docket and, when we should have some type of resolution sometime this year, exact date when the final decision comes out and things are eligible to be billed on. But working with them and talking with them, they explained to me that, they've been just basically charge at night, go do their morning runs like a school bus would do, come back, plug in again, and then, do their runs in the afternoon and then charge again that night to get up to full value. Speaking with them so that they're on our general service rate. Okay, so they have to, work with that. But if they seem to think that they have flexibility built into the school buses, they're smart enough to know the school bus where you could plug it in, program in when they're going to charge. Okay, so if they can work within our off-peak periods, moving to a time of use rate, for them, it would probably be rate 27. They're currently billed on rate 30. It could be rate 37 if they get to a certain size. But that would save them quite a bit if they can do that, or at least, attempt to do that. They thought that they could, work within that, but again, they haven't, it's still up to them. They've got to be able to go out, the customer decides what rate, whatever rates are applicable to, but, they have to make that determination. We don't automatically move somebody, it's still their thing. So I had the conversation. I also then spoke with their consultant from CBIA, who's also working with them, and basically laid out the same thing. So I'm hoping that, they will, take the advice and, work through it. And then once they get, onto that, and then when a medium to heavy duty rate comes in place, that will also help to mitigate demand charge, because that's the issue for them. It's the demand charge, the low load factor. Again, only 3 or 4 months worth of data. So it's not, it's not a full calendar year where you've gotten, differentiations, but that's really the only one that I'm aware of that we have, data for. There may be more. I've asked the, consultant that from CBIA that's working with, various ones. And, if there could be others, I don't know. There could be ones at the UI service territory. I don't know. But, from what we're aware of, this is the only, source of real data that we have yet. So just wanted to kind of shed a little bit of light, and always available for questions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think we can definitely follow up. My next slide we'll get into acquiring data, and maybe we can follow up more on your discussions with DATCO and further have that be a data point that we can have the EDCs use for simulations. Real quick before we get to acquiring data, though, I wanted to go on this slide to follow up on something that Connecticut Green Bank had said about year 0 or year 1. I forget exactly how you said it, but I think this concern from Zoom about the sliding scale based on load factor. And the concern that there'd be variability in rates. We heard the EDC's response, that the billing tier would be known in January so that school districts and ESP operators can project billing costs for the year. I wanted to ask Connecticut Green Bank if you could describe that concern you had about year one or year zero, how you put it.
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned before, what we've heard from operators in schools is just that they feel under a lot of pressure in the first year to not have there be any interruptions to either their school bus route, logistics, just getting kids to school on time, and then also still realizing a similar cost of fuel procurement, whether that's, diesel or electric. And so I think that as we step into, designing a fleet advisory services program and working with schools and operators directly, we just want to make sure that for that first year of operation, that the data that the first year load factor tier is based on is at least somewhat representative of how they're going to be charging the buses. And I think thinking about that in either a school bus operator context where they're potentially using some offsite facility that potentially doesn't have robust electric capacity at the moment, or a school parking buses on campus, potentially there's some data effects with the electric consumption at those buildings. Just thinking about those various scenarios and how that may either align or distort the load factor tier that they're going to be on so that they're kind of on the correct one for that first year of operation. And then obviously like iterating as you go and getting, more exactly to the proper tier as you refine the driving and charging operations, and then also add more buses to the fleet.
I just add that I appreciate Mr. Davis's comments regarding the fact that this is a new rate and we don't actually know how it's going to work until we start using it. And as we move forward to offer the fleet advisory service, I look forward to working with our utility colleagues to help provide those projections and start to see how school districts actually respond to them. And yeah, our interest is mostly in having a system that we can describe to school districts about how their operations need to change as they swap over from diesel to electric for their fuel source.
Thank you. Would the EDCs like to respond to that concern?
Yeah, first of all, I can totally appreciate the challenges here. I maybe tap into Mr. Merzieski again to his experience, because we do, as much as we have the opportunity, work with individual customers. And I know, Jim, do you have a
Yeah, so
help?
regarding the issue of that first year of charging, so we proposed in the tariffs that first year, what we call kind of a slow start. So you're starting on tier one. So tier one is all per kilowatt hours. There is no demand charges associated with it. So I'll give you an example. If we had medium heavy duty rates today, say they started next month, which is, March of this year, they would be on tier one billing for the remainder of this year. And then the remainder of the following year. So all of 2026. Now in December of 2026, we would then have 12 months in that calendar year. We would then analyze monthly load factors and see, based off of that, now you've got a full year, full seasonality, all the way through. We look at it, and then we would then place it so now your 2027 year is based on 26 years worth of data, and then what tier, would be determined, and then they're on that tier for that following year, for 2027. So just to give a little bit of clarity, and also, yet that they should know or be able to know, what their costs are going to be, because it's kilowatt hours. All right, it's about as simple as you can get. You have a customer charge and per kilowatt hour charges. So hopefully that's all.
I want to comment further. It's probably likely that even, let's say it was Mr. Merzieski example where here you are in February, and you're looking at the prospect of, a year and 10 months. I would imagine we'd be totally open to kind of maybe further discussing. I mean, you got to realize the structures, what we just described is, there's a stable known rate structure. But the startup for the customer, you may not exactly know, or you might have, maybe you start out with, one set of vehicles and that grows during that time. And, there's probably a lot of dynamics that are sort of like inputs and parameters to that's decision-making and establishing that load factor. So, there's probably, I would suggest, a need to further think that through with real examples. But at this point, you have a known certain design that you can work with, if those are the sort of provisions of the tariff. That doesn't mean we're inflexible about trying to figure out, is there some way to improve that part of it? To help tune in and start up and maybe that early growth stage. And that could continue. You might have a number of years where the plan, if you're doing fleet advisory service and you're saying, well, I see the customers looking at growing from, 5% to 100% of their fleet. I mean, there's a lot of transitional issues. So the startup piece, clearly, there's some very transparent, clear provisions, as Mr. Mirjewski summarized. And doesn't mean we can't work further to refine that as we go.
So I think that was very helpful discussion. And just for time sensitivity, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which I think is what we've all been getting at here. In the last tech meeting, we all seemed on the same page that acquiring data similar to how Connecticut DOT did in response to CAE 20 would allow the EDCs to run simulations that would provide greater insight into the viability of scenario 1 for the school bus, for electric school buses. Connecticut Green Bank explained that it could be challenging to acquire this data, but came up with the idea of a technical school that has one of the larger electric school bus deployments in the state, but mentioned that they didn't necessarily have a typical kind of daily school bus route for those buses. However, they may be an entity that would be willing to share the data. So I just wanted to open the floor to ideas. One also being DATCO is mentioned, and float the idea out there of, are there other ways we could acquire data from other jurisdictions that may have a more typical kind of daily bus route schedule, and just put that to Connecticut Green Bank first.
Yeah, we were just chatting about that with our mics off. Yeah, I think the state is just on the cusp of starting to add electric school buses to its fleet. This has largely been driven by a federal grant program that the EPA runs. So we expect to see, we hope to see a couple of 100 buses get added to the Connecticut electric fleet in the next few years as those grants come to Connecticut and the buses get operationalized. Right now, CTEX, the Connecticut Technical
Education Career System.
Thank you. The Connecticut Technical Education Career System, a quasi-public that operates technical high schools throughout the state, is one of the first to add a large number of electric vehicles to their fleets. But as we alluded to in our comments, they don't operate in traditional routes. They go further distances. They operate at unusual times. The other sort of confounding factor is that most school buses, when you think of them, are sort of the type C, the larger school buses. And a lot of the early adoption we've seen in the state are sort of the smaller type A buses, which are the short buses. So just thinking through the different charging needs for those. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think that as Sarah alluded to, the CTEX buses are mainly used for like inter-school transport services. So they may not be the best corollary for like a daily school bus run, like all of us sort of imagine it. That being said, they are receiving a grant for another 25 buses that will be used for more traditional types of services. So they may be a good kind of steady candidate down the line. And then I think it may be worth looking at some of the DERA grant recipients. That's the Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant that that DEEP administers. And so some of those initial projects might also be a good data source, but they tend to be a bit smaller. And I think that the DATCO Volkswagen Award is probably like the best bet that we have in terms of a up and operating fleet that could provide good data for the months and years to come.
I just want to add the caution, and like we've heard this before from other jurisdictions as well, that we definitely want to get as much data as we can, but to expect that there's some typical school bus fleet is a challenge, right? The way Bridgeport operates may be very, very different than Newtown, just given the geographies that they're covering and the times of the school operation. Just to throw that caution out there and highlighted by what Mr. Moss just said.
Yeah, what I'm thinking about is we have started to collect information about specific projects and the buses and how they operate. We have information about the diesel buses that they're looking to replace with electric. I'm wondering if we can get backwards to estimating. A part of the problem is they don't know how they're going to operate them differently under the electric paradigm, or I think part of the reason we saw that 17-hour figure on the previous question was that, generally these bus yards are unstaffed overnight. They want to plug them in and go home, and they're not back there until the morning. So, thinking about, does that need to change? Do you need to program in the charging patterns? All of that is sort of an unknown, but if it would be helpful to provide information about how the diesel fleets are operating, we do have some of that information.
I'm glad you brought that up, Sarah. That I was assuming that electric vehicle charging could be managed somehow. So when I was talking about, here's a rate design, and then you look at your operations, so you probably know your routes, you probably know how when you're a large window you might need to charge when you're not operating the route, but I was assuming, I'm far from knowing the details of how this works, but talking with the DOT, they have a pretty sophisticated energy management system. I would assume even the smallest of vehicles have some capability of being able to be managed somehow, like schedule the charging, things like that. That's just an example, but to Mr. Bowen's point, and probably what we're hearing collectively, it probably, at the end of the day, still boils down to getting your best estimate for your actual application for each fleet. I would think would probably be the best way to model and try to, quantify not only the impacts under one assumption, but options you have to manage and do things differently. So it's kind of a learning process for us all, and I think it really does, at the end of the day, we can find examples, and I think the more we have, the better, but you still have to translate that to each use case, whether it's a regional bus or a company that's providing a service to multiple towns and they're managing that fleet, or it's an individual town managing their own fleet or otherwise. It still probably ultimately boils down to that.
The Green Bank and DEEP this winter ran a solicitation for electric school bus projects. We are still in the process of making awards and determinations about the bids received from that. But I do wonder if that cohort of projects could be sort of an early stage users of whatever rate design the docket determines. We expect the fleets to be deployed by April of 2026 at the latest. So they'll be going through the interconnection application process later this year. Look for more to come on that. But we did receive applications for a total of 192 buses, which were supported by 258 chargers, a combination of level 2 and DC fast chargers. So again, those are largely funded by federal funds, but will be supported jointly by Green Bank financing and DEEP grant funding.
So question, so was a requirement for receiving that funding, was data sharing part of the requirement for the customer to share some of their data to be eligible to receive that funding, or was that not part of the the scope?
We haven't written requirements yet. If
Okay.
there is data that we would like, we're happy to include that in the
I think
requirement.
that'd be helpful just to sort of give us access to as much data as possible to be able to start informing some of these conversations.
Okay, great. Maybe we can confer with you later regarding what data needs to be collected.
Sounds good. Thanks.
That was gonna be my follow-up was, for the purposes of getting things on the record for this docket, I know the EDCs have previously said that, the response to CAE 20 from, Connecticut DOT provided the type and form of the data that they need, that the EDCs need to do simulations. Is that still the case? And I guess just trying to think what would be what are the next steps for getting some of this data in this docket? And maybe the timeline of that, considering the timeline that we have on the external docket currently with the decision, to see if anyone has any comments.
For Eversource purposes, yes. Basically breaks out, you know, on and off peak kilowatt hours, on and off peak demand. Ideally 12 months worth. It also provided why you'll have to kind of, there was some give and take because they weren't really sure, you know, when they tried, so they modeled it. Their staff actually did the modeling, you know, how they thought they could, off of, you know, buses that they had, how many hours they expected to run them, with, you know, when they could charge, everything else. So we did work with them though, because, you know, just so that they could understand how the rates work and what we were really asking for. So there was some, you know, some give and take for them that, you know, help them, you know, go through that process. Know if there's someone that's capable of doing that. School buses, and, you know, as Mr. Bowen pointed out, we're not just dealing with DOT here, which kind of operates the same way across all their regional areas. Every school district is gonna be somewhat unique. There's probably, you know, yeah, maybe some we group together, they're kind of similar, but, you know, if you've got 200 buses or you have 5 buses, it's be a big difference. You know, how you're going to charge, everything else associated with it. I don't know if there's anyone consultant for any of these things that are working with this. You know, obviously DOT had, you know, had staff that, you know, was involved. I don't know why them. Is there anybody at all that's helping with that or has, you know, help advise?
Helping advise on data collection?
Yeah, so they basically it's modeling now, right? So, all right, so we've got 6 buses. If we operate it this way, how many miles per kilowatt hour? How many miles they have to run? All that type of, that's all the, you know, details are going into trying to model that data.
I mean, a lot of that information was provided in our total cost of ownership model for school buses. It's not specific to a bus. It's more general to how a bus could operate under the scenario 1 estimates. I think that given the timeline that you talked through with, you know, the year 1 plus the initial months being volumetric based, we're going to be generating a lot of data in the first 18 months of this rate that we're going to have before the demand charges go into effect. I wonder if that can provide the necessary information. I mean, we can solicit information from our colleagues in Massachusetts and New York who are operating school bus fleets, but as we've alluded to, you know, the fleets are different and operate differently in different places, depending on rural and urban mixes, especially.
Can I ask, you mentioned a cohort of 192 buses earlier.
Mhm.
Is that in that total cost of ownership model?
No, the cohort of The total cost of ownership model looks at a sample bus fleet that is
Oh, I see.
operating in the
Okay.
state versus the solicitation we ran. We
Okay.
received bids for a total of 192 buses.
So, knowing the information that we would want, and then CA 2020 provides some details on what information would be needed. But could a sampling of buses and somebody who maybe have modeled perhaps representative operations or municipalities or towns help, with that? Is that kind of information available?
Might have to press the button.
How about now?
Better.
Paul Farrell, I'm the Director of Planning and Standards and the Air Bureau at DEEP. We have a lot of information that came in these applications for these grants that we put out there, and without really throwing anyone under the electric bus, so to speak, I will go out on a limb and say we could grab a representative from First Student and connect with you folks offline and start to develop the scenarios that they're envisioning for the deployment of these buses so that we can give you sort of route miles, urban, rural, suburban, charging times, just, basically, I think everything that you would need to start that initial analysis.
Thank you. I think that's exactly what we found to be the most helpful ultimately for everybody. It's not just, our doing the math.
I mean, and to point out one more thing, there's EV rates started in 2009. We started with what was called the EV rate rider, which was all per kilowatt hour based. That ran for 5 years. At the time, Pura looked at it and said, okay, we need something more long-term, more sustainable. And suggested we look at Rocky Mountain Institute, so that therefore, as it's kind of like the second generation of our rates. So that started the light duty EV rates. That started in January 24, 5 years later, right? Now, in a perfect world, we would have all this data. We would know, all these different scenarios, and we could put it against it. But in this case, we really don't have that. So, and we have customers that are coming online that are not going to be able to use that rate until it gets approved. All right. So, will rates be different sometime in the future? Sure. But without having real data, and waiting till we get real data, we think we've got a rate that will work. I believe wholeheartedly that, scenario one will mitigate demand charges for these customers. All right. And at that point, they'll start coming online. You'll have real data, everything else. So, is there maybe a change 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road now that we know how all this works? That could be a potential likely outward. Maybe someone has a better idea for a rate. That could come in place too. But in our opinion, we've got something in place today, that will service these customers, mitigate the pricing, and, is workable for them. So I guess, my thought is we've got to, we cannot continue to drag this docket on. We've got one customer who was already, put in service, and yeah, he can kind of deal with the general service rates, but we've got nothing else to offer him. So yeah, at this point, I think we just need at some point to make the decision that, all right, this is going to work. All right. Because, we've gone through a few iterations of things where looking at different opportunities, look at different scenarios, everything else, what else is out there. This is what we have. So at some point we just got to get across the finish line, and start this process. And at that point, collect data. We know what we have. If things need to change, like anything else, things evolve. So if we were on a 5 year, maybe in 5 years from now or 4 years from now, you know, a new rate comes up, but, you know, without all that data, it's really, you know, you're trying to solve a problem that you don't know what it is. Or if you even have one. That's, you know, the reality of where we are.
And to wrap this up, just for time constraints, because we want to move on to a more roundtable discussion after this rate design discussion. But this has been very helpful. I think we're getting to the real issues here, and I think this conversation that we've all talked about facilitating here would be very helpful. I just want to ask one last question, which would be how are we going to get these results of this potential conversation in this docket? So maybe what would be like a reasonable timeline to facilitate this conversation? And then how may we get the results of that conversation in the docket, maybe through correspondence or a compliance filing? So, or an interrogatory.
I assume that you want the results of the studies, not necessarily the raw data itself. We can furnish the raw data regarding
Yeah.
the mileage, which was provided to us under a solicitation. I don't think we can provide it publicly. So, but we could provide it to the utilities. And perhaps we can do that within a relatively short time frame. We have it, so we can get it to you in the next few weeks. And then turn over to you for how long it will take to process it.
Attorney Lefebvre, so what specifically are we scoping out here? I just want to make sure I'm clear what we're trying to accomplish.
And that's a good question. The conversation, kind of the back and forth between Connecticut Green Bank, DEEP, just in general, saying that moving the ball forward with getting data or using the total cost of analysis or total cost of ownership model to provide data to run simulations, if I'm articulating that correctly.
So we're looking to provide some representative, I don't know, samples or data that we can model for determining what the bill impact might be?
Yeah, I think there's two questions that I would have. The first one would be for the DATCO one, that we have like an actual school bus, electric school bus in operation. What would their first few months of operation have looked like under scenario one, both under the volumetric and under the eventual demand charge structure? And then for the diesel buses that are transitioning over to electric, based on the mileage and predictions, is there any estimate about what the bill impacts would be for those sites? And I'm trying to remember, there's 3 different locations for that application, and I think that they're all at school bus yards, not at schools, so they don't necessarily have any on-site load, so it might be sort of a more, and I don't remember which territories they're in, Paul or
Yeah. The 3 first student projects are Fairfield, West Hartford, and Paul, do you remember the third? And Ridgefield, thank you. Yeah.
So those are, okay, so the first one's actually, and even though it's still early, you know, only so many months, almost like the bill comparisons we've provided, but more specific to one of the DATCO applications. For these 3 first student transitional examples, I think what I'm asking is it the data in CAE 20 that someone needs to come up with? In other words, the kilowatt hours and kilowatt and related information. So you mentioned mileage, but someone needs to translate whatever those 3 towns set of buses and routes are to, what does that look like for your electric needs?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Green Bank has provided a copy of our total cost of ownership model and some kind of various scenario results in an interrogatory either in August or September of this year that does include some kind of diesel to electric conversion inputs. Those are based on studies from the World Resources Institute. So those give I'd say a reasonable estimate of projecting electric demand based on bus conversions and mileage. So those can be a good starting point. And I think that we'd be happy to dive into that model more fully with the EDCs to see what useful insights it can provide. We primarily use the tool as a way to evaluate the Make Ready and EVSE incentives that have been proposed in this docket.
Okay, so to be specific, I just pulled up CA 20 and there's 5 quantities, average monthly on-peak kilowatt hours, same average monthly off-peak kilowatt hours, average monthly on-peak demand, whether it's measured in KW or KVA, same thing for off-peak, and the maximum annual demand. And we can certainly, I mean, it's available, we certainly can provide that, but that's probably the bare minimum information we would need, over a 12-month period or a representative period. And I think that would give us the core information that we need to run that analysis.
The challenge is we don't know how the school bus operators would choose to operate those
Yeah,
vehicles.
that's
So,
what that's what
you
I
know,
figured.
Are they going to come in and plug it in at the end of the day, or are they going to do something more sophisticated with the?
I also think, and regardless, whatever rate design, you can say, well, here's what I think it's going to be. And then when you see it, you say, well, what can I do better? This is true for any customer. The sophisticated, large C&I customer would typically, facilities manager will, understand the rates and try to manage their operations in a way that, and so this is no different here. But for the fact that it's a lot of unknowns that we're learning about. But I guess we'd have to collaborate with you on that.
Yeah, I think perhaps the useful data would be if you have a certain number of buses and connecting into a certain number of chargers, because we do know what kind of buses and chargers they're planning to deploy at each site. If they were to operate it at maximum efficiency, what would their bill impact be versus, if they just plugged it in overnight? Is that a potential range of bill impacts?
It's a good goal. Optimization, maximum efficiency. Maybe I'll look for some help from folks closer to the technology, but any suggestions on how we can guide it's clear with the data we need for electric service to a charging station. I mean, that's what I'm asking for, but taking it from a set of buses and how they operate hour to hour throughout a month, that's kind of the
And
challenge.
part of the input into that equation is knowing what their charging window would be and then optimizing what EVSE would lead to an optimized charging experience, right? So that was part of the issue with the customer that we referenced before, is that they weren't necessarily charging optimally, right? They were charging in a shorter window than they needed to, and thus using more kilowatts than they needed to, which led to suboptimal experience on the bill. But so I don't know. It would be like an individual case by case. How do you optimize the charging setup configuration to get the best charging, the optimized charging? But
And for the DATCO situation, to make it a little more challenging also, since the customer is not on a time of use rate today, we don't have on-peak, off-peak data. So all we have is demand for the month, kilowatt hours for the month. So that's what's on their bill today. So that still doesn't, that would still need to be kind of, okay, well, if we did it differently, this is how we could have broken this out. But unfortunately, it's not even data that straight out of it that you can just model, into the scenario.
I'm gonna cut us off here just for just so we can get to the rest of the discussion. But this is very helpful. I think we moved the ball forward a lot here with rate design. So I appreciate everyone's comments, and I think the best move forward is for the participants here to continue this conversation offline. And we'll just say by mid-March to provide us with the results of this collaboration via a correspondence on the docket. And before we move on, I'm just going to pass it to my colleague Danielle. She had a couple clarifying questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. Danielle Shalou with Pura. I just had a couple of clarifying questions on your presentation, going back to the different technologies. So you mentioned managed charging for fleets is limited to pilots in the light duty space. And can you talk a little bit more about those pilots and what are they and what are the characteristics of the fleet?
Can I invite a phone a friend?
Sure.
To come up? Mark, do you mind talking a little bit more about what we're doing with fleet charging, managed charging?
Sure.
I'm Mark Moniz. I'm in the managed charging and demand response team at Eversource. Hello? Got me?
That's better, yeah.
All right. Yeah, for light duty fleets, we had our first.
Sorry, could you just introduce yourself one more time?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Mark Moniz. I'm on the managed charging and demand response team at Eversource. For light duty fleets this past summer, we ran demand response program with 2 small light duty fleets, and that's the extent of our participation to this point.
So how many vehicles are in the fleet? What does their operations look like?
Yeah.
Just broad strokes.
Yeah, no, it's a good question because it's a combination right now. They're filling out their fleets. That's something that's happening. So one of the fleets is actually 2 vehicles, and the other one I think is 3 or 4. I'd have to look.
Okay.
But that they included all of their chargers in it. So these operators were able to operate. One's a workplace and one's a town. And they were able to kind of operate as if they were fleet charging. So we were able to kind of, they were managing their charges to the light duty fleet charging program.
Okay.
So what they did at the end of the season is they supplied us, we were able to gather their data through ChargePoint and basically go through each charging session during demand response events and see whether or not they charged during those events. And that's how we calculated their incentive payments for the end of the season.
Okay, great. And the operational characteristics of the fleets are like they're in use all day, or they go out, a little bit and come back?
Yep. I mean, so for our light duty fleet program, there's 2 options, right? There's the demand response option and there's the customized option. Both of these participate in the demand response option. So we have not analyzed charging.
Okay, or their use at
patterns.
all?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
great,
Specifically for the fleets too. And so the chargers and of course the vehicles are separate. So,
great.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, Ms. Braun, you can also phone another friend for this next question. When we're talking about automated load management and the energy management systems, you mentioned there's a certain level of power that they can draw. Does that change based on the time of day or anything, or it's set for the location?
Yeah, I think that would depend. So for the first one, for automated load management, that's set, right?
Okay.
You can't, don't go over this amount. I think energy management system could be potentially regulated by time of day, but that's more getting into kind of what Brian was describing as flexible interconnect, and that's as he described, super early stage for EV charging, and then I think PG&E's Flex Connect pilot is the only one we're aware of.
Okay. And so that's my next question is on flexible interconnection. And you mentioned it being a bridging solution so that customers can get on the grid before the grid upgrades. So is this always intended to be a temporary stopgap? Does that get put into whatever interconnection agreement?
So I can speak. So there are actually 2 pilots that are happening in California. One is the Flex Connect for PG&E, And then I believe SoCal Edison's analog is called the Load Control Management System Pilot. Those are intended to those are not intended to replace the need to eventually have to upgrade the system. But there were specific customers, in some cases EV charging customers, part of those pilot programs. I believe one of the customers is a PepsiCo manufacturing plant that is looking to install or to operationalize, I think it's 50 Tesla semi trucks. And those are their plans, and they wouldn't be able to, it's going to take a lot of work to get that load out of the system. And so in the meantime, Flex Connect allows them to participate and then at least potentially have access to a large chunk of power from the system during certain times and then be constrained, but it's better than nothing. So
Right.
it's not intended to replace the need for either of those companies in the way that we're sort of envisioning it. It wouldn't be in lieu of upgrading the system. It would just be sort of a bridging solution or a stopgap measure to get to that feature state.
Okay, and do you have a sense of, in terms of, because it all comes back to the cost allocation. So do you have any insight onto what the cost allocation among customers for those upgrades could look like? Or it's all hypothetical at this point, so we don't
I
really
think
know.
it's all hypothetical at this point. I think right now, going back to California, they're really just testing the ability to stand up these systems and to operationalize them. They pointed to how it took a year and a half to get these systems stood up. There's very early learnings about that, but I'm not even sure they really thought through sort of if this program were to scale, what would that sort of cost allocation look like?
Okay, so then you also talked about the potential of deploying any kind of pilot via IES or elsewhere, but are either of you aware of customers that are interested or would be interested or who you could partner with in the IES program or for one of these alternative connection sorts of?
So I think it would depend on what solution is it that we're trying to ultimately test through IES. So I would say that similar to how California did it, it's good to have customers in mind going into it to make sure that the pilot is tailored to serve their needs, to try to glean the most impactful learnings from it. But we have not looked at, specific customers that we might want to enable through each of these individual solutions. That would be part of the planning process for the pilot program.
Okay, great. Those are all my questions for right now.
Thank you. All right, at this time, we're going to take a 10-minute break. So everyone can come back at 10:50. And at that point, I'll ask anyone that has identified as being representative of their organizations to try and come up closer so we can facilitate the more of the roundtable portion of today's discussion. And we will be able to, different stakeholders will be able to ask questions about rate design during that portion again as well. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
Hello.
Learn more about rates today than I did. Yeah, and it's getting more and more. That's $1 trillion. That's 6 months. It's like last night, so I don't know if you can tell. These guys. Oh, no, man, but. Yeah, this is our third, but two wasn't anything. Well, it's when. That's a boy girl. Nice. Yeah, I know, they're like. Exactly.
Right, what's your conference?
Right, yeah, you almost better like, I mean, and that's the strategy. Sometimes it flood the zone, just kind of overload people. That's the strategy. You know, turn it off and then not paying attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. Improved and there are. And you still have. Yeah, they were smart. There are too many kids. We have Good, good. Get, we're 16, we're over another 60. 60, yeah. Operating and we ordered 20 more. We're one of the grants.
All right, it is 10:50 a.m. If everyone could please return to their seats at this time. Feel free to pull chairs up if you need to. Not the perfect space for a roundtable, but thank you for entertaining us. Great. Excellent. All right. So to get started, I think we'll just do a quick round of introductions so everyone is aware of who's in the room here and at the table. And so maybe we'll start with you, Ms. Briggs, and just go around, say your name and affiliation.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Briggs. I'm an attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation.
Sarah Harari, Associate Director, the Director of Innovation at the Connecticut Green Bank.
Kevin Moss, Senior Manager for Clean Transportation at the Connecticut Green Bank.
Jennifer Kritzler, Deputy Director for CalStar's Northeast Regional Office.
Hi, Emily Pish, Senior Advisor for Transportation Decarbonization at Deep Bureau of Energy and Technology Policy.
Paul Kritzler, Supervisor of the Mobile Source at the Air Bureau.
Paul Farrell, Director of Air Planning, Air Bureau at Deep.
Sarah Crame at Sierra Club.
Harisha Bandari, Staff Attorney for the Office of Consumer Counsel.
Graham Curtis, Connecticut DOT, BEB Program Manager.
Mark Holka, Manager of Pricing at UI.
Brian Morris, Manager of Clean Energy Policy at UI. And just real quick to flag, as Mr. Bond phoned a friend earlier, we do have some Eversource and UI colleagues in the audience that we might want to sort of tap in for certain parts of the conversation. Thanks.
Kevin Bond, Manager of Clean Energy Strategy at Eversource.
Ed Davis, Director of Rates for Eversource.
Jim Merzhatsky, Team Leader, Connecticut Rates for Eversource.
Danielle Shalou, Research Analyst, Connecticut Pura.
Hi, Arthur Lefebvre, attorney with Pure Adjudications.
And Julia Dumaine, Supervisor of Strategy and Operations for Pura. Great, so thank you again for everyone joining today. At this time, we want to open up for more roundtable discussion particularly on the topics listed on the screen. And before, actually, to jump in, we wanted to offer any organizations that did not have a chance to participate in this morning's discussion on rate design to ask any questions or make any statements regarding rate design, either existing positions or reactions to anything that you heard. So.
Sorry, just very quickly, wanted to just encourage the council to consider collaboration throughout the region, recognizing that Connecticut's not on an island and that New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey are looking at very similar tasks and challenges. To take a look at the things that NYSERDA is doing with their electric school buses. I know they're collecting data through the TVIP program of school buses that are operating, as well as Mass CEC with some of their school bus deployments. Boston, for example, has one of the largest CSB fleets in the Northeast. So just recognizing that we're not on an island, and I definitely encourage collaborations within the states.
Anyone else? Okay. All right.
Not on rate design.
Okay. All right. So we heard a lot this morning about the rate design components, but I think, do we want to pull up any other slides for facilitation?
No.
Okay. Is there anyone that would like to raise any questions or discussion on any of the other topics on the screen here, or any questions that authority staff would like to start off with to?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about fleet advisory services a little bit, because we know that there's a variety of distinct services that all have varying costs. And what I would really love to hear from you all is kind of an evaluation of whether how customers need to demonstrate any commitment to electrifying before receiving those services. You know, our partners at the Green Bank are going to be undertaking a lot of that work. So kind of talking about, should customers need to demonstrate any commitment, and if so, what ladder of offerings should we be leaning towards?
Perhaps I'll start out by reminding the participants here today what we've proposed so far in the docket, which is a dual structure that has both a short-term engagement to develop a fleet electrification program and then a longer-term, less intense engagement as fleets begin to electrify, to support school districts, to talk to school boards about the costs of it, to work with the utilities around interconnection, to work with school bus operators to procure school buses, renegotiate their contracts. So sort of splitting up into two different types of advisory services that we hope to offer. As we've proposed to the docket, the Green Bank intends to use our own funding to support distressed municipalities to go through this program. And in our most recent filing under CAE 90, we provided additional information that we're hoping to do a cohort style model where we have groups of schools or school bus operators going through this together. We hope to run 2 this year, one that is this summer and then one following on. We ran an RFI regarding our scope for the fleet advisory services sort of towards the end of last year and provided details into the docket regarding the responses there. And we hope to go out for RFP later this month, now that we have been officially designated as the fleet advisory service provider for school bus districts. That's a great question regarding what level of commitment we need from the participants in it. I think that we hope to work with whatever selected consultant we have to ultimately determine that. We put forward a couple of different ideas that we're working with now into the docket. Those were one, requiring a formal letter from the school district and the operator of their willingness to participate, and designating a point person to participate in it. As we know, school bus districts tend to be, there's a lot of things going on. And so having somebody that can champion this work bought into participating in the short-term engagement will be essential. Additionally, we've also proposed a data sharing commitment to the questions we discussed earlier. We want to make sure that whatever data is generated through the FAS program can inform and reinforce decisions that are made both by the Green Bank as we move forward and offer the FAS service to additional districts, and also to this proceeding so that we have additional information regarding where the fleets are, what their charging patterns are, what the main barriers are to their electrification. Additionally, one of the things that we have considered is requiring some type of commitment that they will take whatever plan that is developed in the short term and put it into practice. Of course, we cannot require that they fully electrify their fleets or that they take any specific action, but thinking about what is a good faith effort that they can take as a follow-on. And again, recognizing that this is often challenging, we do hope to provide sort of an ongoing as needed service to support those districts to implement the plans, and they don't just collect dust on a shelf. So that's what we've come up with so far. We would welcome ideas from the rest of the docket participants about what's worked in the past in other similar programs that has provided sort of the free services to advise, or any additional actions that we should consider as we embark on developing this program.
Jennifer Kritzler, I'd like to just kind of expand on the comments that CalSTART filed in November about fleet advisory services, right? One of the things that we really advise is that districts, fleets, anyone who wants to electrify is much more likely to succeed once they understand those barriers, once they have the opportunity to talk to their utility and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing, what rate should I be looking at? How do I know what I need to be doing? And it's a lot to undertake. So a fleet advisory program really meets the fleet where they're at to understand how many buses do I have, how many routes am I doing, and just gives them a roadmap on how they can succeed in the short and long term. So I think that's your very basic high level free program. You know, if you wanted to create an incentive program from the utilities, or, you know, for buying vehicles or buying chargers, and then require that they go through fleet advisory to give them a bonus, like that kind of acts as a carrot to get them to go through that. I think we're still too early in the electrification process to require someone who to go through a fleet advisory services to electrify. Again, you want to kind of be a champion and a guide through this process right now to help clear up all of the barriers and help them understand how to succeed.
Just want to make sure there's no one else who wants to chime in on that. So to follow up on that question, can you talk a little bit about like the more expansive or involved offerings that might be useful later on? You know, once you have the, like, this is how many buses you have, and here's how we electrify them. Like, where is that line between the easy, simple version and then the more involved, more expensive version?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is that huge gamut, right? You can have that very high level. We have 20 buses right now. Here's how old they are. Here's how many miles they're driving. Here are the buses that can do the duty cycles that we're doing. Here are the number of chargers that we might need, and here's what's on the market. Then you can get really into the details, taking your existing data, as Sarah mentioned, right? Taking a look at the diesel buses, how much they're idling, how many miles they're driving, what they're drawing for like HVAC and when it's really cold outside, right? And really modeling out how much energy is going to be needed. So you get really into the total cost of ownership by understanding the rate to charge, the procurement costs, right? You kind of get into those nitty-gritty details of laying out a procurement plan along with financial impact. And then you also can get even further into providing that technical deployment assistance, where you have someone who is working with the school district on a day-to-day basis to make sure that contracts are signed and, you know, shovels are getting into the ground, and then also supporting after the fact to collect the electric bills and share the data back with the utility and facilitate those discussions so that it's more of a back and forth than just a here's a report and walk away.
Okay, we are, so just in terms of level setting, we do want this to be a conversation. So not necessarily, always coming back to the staff up here. So I just want to make sure that there's an opportunity for folks to jump in. If there's any other thoughts to add on, specific to fleet advisory services. You're good.
More perspectives from where, Deep sat, especially in the, air and energy worlds. One of the things that we're going to be looking at as part of this current grant process we're going through is, potential for these buses to support resilience efforts. So we're not sure exactly what that could look like. If it's, something V2X that you're going to have essentially these large batteries sitting there that could be deployed in the event of an emergency. That could be conversations that could be had on the front end as well. And again, conversations better had in the front end of life for the batteries. What happens to these when you're done with them? Could that be energy storage? Could be grid scale energy storage if you have enough electric school buses at some point in the future. So, not just getting them started and getting them on the road successfully, but sort of looking at as a process through to conclusion.
The V2X microgrids, right? Considering that these are now big batteries that could be potential farms for resiliency to go back to the grid to provide power.
Thanks. One of the other questions I had was about, and I'm not sure exactly who the right organization is for this, but is there a way, like, how do we calculate the number of buses a charger can support, like the number of buses per charger? Is that something that goes through fleet advisory services? Is there a known value for that?
I'm going to start and then pass it along to colleagues that are working on specific applications. But I will say that from the bids that we received in through the solicitation that we ran with Deep, right now they're thinking about one-to-one. They're thinking about bringing their entire fleet back and plugging it in right away, and mostly into DC fast chargers. And that's just because they're used to the idea that vehicles are available when you need to drive them. I think that we are in the very early stages of fleet operators thinking about, do you rotate through? Do you consider something differently? I don't know that there's a good way to predict how it will change in the future. I think it's a little bit of chicken and egg with regards to the rate and how the rate is structured, how the market will respond regarding the number of chargers and how they cycle through. But right now it's about one-to-one.
Yeah, I would just add specifically, we're seeing more and more of the operators indicate a preference for 30 kilowatt one-to-one chargers. So essentially like a relatively low power DC fast charger. That's just pretty simple to use on that one-to-one basis that Sarah was describing. And then another piece of data we can share is that Zoom received 2 grants to the EPA to support 46 electric school buses, and they intend to install vehicle to grid capable chargers for all of those buses. So that could be a potential strong candidate for V2G studies down the line.
Yeah, I'll second that. A lot of the deployments right now, because it's so new and it's a change in operations, everybody's going one port to one vehicle. So it could be a dual port charger, but a lot of folks are saying, well, I'm going to need as much power as I could possibly get, which becomes a barrier for the utility to say, well, I want to install 10 buses. Now I need 10 ports, each doing 50 kilowatts, right? So it becomes a big barrier, and understanding what the impact is on that and how you could implement managed charging or implement cycled charging to reduce the amount of ports and reduce the amount of charging time that you need, I think really is something that talking about how vehicles are used and going through fleet advisory system can really help. Thinking about, well, the bus is sitting there for 17 hours. It doesn't need to be charged all 17 hours, right? So you could have someone cycling it out and plugging it and unplugging it, but it's a change to the operation for the organization who's used to being able to fuel up and leave the bus.
So I just want to flag that there's a lot of discussion around how FAS can be beneficial to fleets. But I want to emphasize how beneficial it is for the utility company, right? So there's been some discussion in this docket about fleet inventories. And, you know, for us, one of the best ways for us to know where fleets are is to understand which fleets have engaged with an FAS administrator. Planning is very important for us, and especially when you think about the primary use cases in this proceeding, so transit buses and school buses, there's some potentially large loads. And so for us to have sort of some, the ability to have that information early, to be able to plan for those capacity increases is very helpful to us. And I think it's really important information for us to capture through the FAS process.
Mr. Curtis, I thought you were signaling.
Yeah, just to relay our experience on the charging. So initially, in our pilot programs, we were going 1-to-1. A transit bus is 5 times, battery is 5 times bigger, so the ratios are different. But initially, we were using 150s 1-to-1, and that was our pilot. So that was because, you know, we wanted to reduce the number of things that go wrong. As evolved, the marketplace is also evolving rapidly. So right now, we're moving to a 2-to-1 model. So 150 with 2 chargers. There's a lot of people going to a 3-to-1 charger with managed charging, and that gives you the ability with software, and we can talk about that later, to work the charger, you know, and optimize the charger and minimize the rate. But that's kind of where the market is. And the module is kind of at a 60 now. It was 50, it's moving to 60. So 60, 180, you know, 480, if I'm doing the math correctly. So, and there's been a lot of consolidation in the marketplace for chargers. So some of that is driven by that. We're building a smaller facility for our paratransits. We're going to use a 60 2-to-1 charging. That's what we're anticipating. So that's kind of, but it's a moving target. This changes every 18 months. So right now, but it seems to be settling in to those kind of models.
And I just want to ask a question, because this goes back to our definitions thing, right? So when you say managed charging, you mean your internal scheduling of your own charging, not the utility managing your charging.
That's correct. We have, I mean, we currently have software that manages the charging, and we're working, you know, with UI, talking about using a grid scale charging to regulate it on the other side. Right now, we're doing it at our facility for our own optimization for load shedding and also manpower to facilitate that. So we're not plugging buses in and, you know, taking them out. It's manpower intensive. We could plug them all in and manage it, you know, operationally. That's the best way to, you know, for us to do that. Because labor is a huge part of our cost.
Okay. Any other thoughts on fleet advisory services at the moment?
Just to respond to Mr. Morris's comment earlier, we do want to flag that in our, I think it was our September filing, that we provided some data again from the World Resources Institute, who's done mapping of all school bus yards in the country. It's not a perfect projection by any means, but they found 165 or so in Connecticut that are in the EDC's territories. And so then we married that data with the EDC capacity maps, and about 90 of them were kind of in the like 400 kilowatts of capacity or less. So kind of a like low potential school bus yard site. We know that it's not wise to exactly use the capacity maps to project exactly how much load can go on at those sites, but we think that it generally paints a picture that a lot of utility side investment will be needed to support kind of large school bus electrification projects. So I think that's something that, as we again launch FAS, that we want to work with the EDCs to figure out where a school bus is likely to come online, where are those likely constraints, and where can really smart investments be made.
Great. So connected to that idea of actually installing the charging yards. Now, so this is kind of a question for the EDCs again, but now that we've got decisions in the non-wire solutions and interconnection dockets, and I don't know if you all can speak to that necessarily, but could these kinds of interconnection requests be incorporated into the non-wire solutions process?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure we have the folks from Eversource to answer that.
And I think unfortunately, the same goes for UI. I don't think we have the right folks that are experts in that
Okay.
docket to be able to speak to it.
Ms. Shalhoub, can you explain more about how you, what the background behind the question?
Yeah.
We're also not following that docket.
Okay, so this is so our understanding is that the non-wire solutions process is working is set up so that the EDCs identify what the grid needs are and then issue an RFP saying, okay, can anyone solve these grid needs? And as we're anticipating this, medium and heavy duty bus electrification, that's going to be a big grid need of, okay, we're going to need a bunch of electricity at these various places. And so I guess I'm sure, and we can follow up with an interrogatory so you can get it to the right folks, but it's how can, knowing that we're going to have electrification of electric school buses in the long term and planning for that appropriately on the EDC side so that we can look at working, having the fleet advisory services work with the interconnection process so that we're identifying the distribution system upgrades ahead of time so that the charging patterns can be, and the upgrades can be evaluated as far in advance as possible. So hopefully that's helpful.
That is helpful. I don't think that this is something that we can address now, but one
Right.
of the strategies that we've considered with the FAS service is a resulting, again, like we're going to want to have a consultant on board before we formalize this, but having an evaluation that says what can you interconnect at the, how many buses can you put at your depot right now, or on a different parcel of land that the town owns, that does not require a grid upgrade. Like, what is the roadmap for you to fully electrify your fleet? And hopefully that can provide additional information into the grid planning process and will allow us to integrate, an electrified fleet in a cost-efficient manner for both the customer and the ratepayer. Things that keep happening. This is something Sierra Club has also been thinking a lot about. And we've looked at examples in California, Colorado, New Jersey, where those states have been focused on like energization timelines and trying to sort of predict and model where the system will need distribution system upgrades. And then trying to authorize utilities to proactively both plan and make those upgrades, and to authorize, pre-ordering of equipment to reduce any delays associated with supply chain concerns. And then, like in California, they've actually set energization timelines, so like target timelines for service upgrades or new service requests. To try and shorten the amount of time, it takes and to reduce the lag between the amount of time like a medium and heavy duty fleet can, acquire the vehicles and the charging infrastructure, but then can't interconnect because they don't have the distribution upgrade necessary.
Really important is to understand those short and long term, right? How many vehicles can you electrify with the amount of capacity that you have on your existing service? And then what's it going to cost for you to go to your full fleet, right? And so whenever you're talking to utility, you can say, all right, here's what I want to do and how to get there, right? I think it becomes a barrier to a fleet to like install a few chargers and do one upgrade, but then to go install the entire fleet, you're going to need a second upgrade. That just adds complexity. So being informed about what you need as you're going to have those conversations and being able to articulate that to the utility and have that informed conversation to determine, what you need to do now versus what you need to do later is really important.
Okay. I don't know if anyone can actually answer this question. It might be another chicken and egg problem, but you mentioned, moving the bus depots to different town-owned parcels. Is there willingness among operators to make those moves, or they just want things the way they've always been and they don't know that they're willing to move yet?
There's willingness from the Green Bank to engage in that conversation with our participants. I'll maybe leave it at that. I think also one of the things that the Green Bank is working through right now is who is the client for our service? Is it the town or is it the operator? Is it some combination of it? And I think that that will also really impact sort of the answers to those decisions.
Yeah, I would also add that I think it's in many cases, operators are currently renting or leasing property to store school buses under their current school bus contracts. And so potentially renting or leasing property still with the same school district, but just in a different location that has more robust electric capacity may not necessarily change a ton for them in terms of the rental costs that they're paying.
Does that create an issue in terms of if you don't own the land and you make all these upgrades and improvements to install, like, what are those impacts?
So I think that I'll speak to this from two perspectives. The first one is the solicitation that I alluded to before. So this will be state funding that are going to support these projects. And for those projects, for that reason, we are thinking very specifically about how do you ensure that the benefit of those services go to support the town in perpetuity, or at least for as long as we deem reasonable. I think under the Fleet Advisory Services program, I think it again depends on who the client for those services are. If it is an independent for-profit that is the school bus operator and they decide to make the investment and in the future no longer have the bus contract, I think that that is less of a concern of the state, although we will seek to ensure that grid upgrades are used in a way that is most beneficial for the town. So I think we have sort of differing opinions depending on how we are deploying our capital and also depending on who the customer is. My view is that the ideal version is that whatever upgrades are done in such a way where it can be used for the benefit of the community in perpetuity.
Yeah, absolutely. I to answer your question of is it a challenge? Are people looking at it? The answer is yes and no, right? I think it really does depend on who the client is. CalSTART has doing some work in Massachusetts to deploy some electric school buses with Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. One of the clients has identified a new site that they want to install chargers on. They want to start from scratch. They just want to go there. Other ones have a leased facility where they don't really have a whole lot of capacity, but they still want to install charging. So each use case can be very different. And that's where Fleet Advisory Services really can come in to kind of work through all of those little kinks and knots.
One thing that we've highlighted in the docket before that is very unique to Connecticut compared to New York and Massachusetts is 90% of our school buses are owned and operated by third parties rather than the school districts themselves. So it creates a complexity regarding the stakeholders that are participating in this discussion and the contracting cycles. So again, a lot of times under the Connecticut Clean Air Act, school districts were empowered to extend their contract with school bus operators to 10 years if they had at least one electric vehicle in their fleet. And so we expect and hope to see contracts that reflect the nature that the nature of the longer term life cycle for the equipment that's being installed to electrify the fleet.
I have a quick question, maybe for CalSTART and Green Bank as well, but just speaking on the point about interacting, not, being clear about who the actual client is. Are there other stakeholders that, in CalSTART's experience, that are important to involve in the process of electrification that maybe aren't just the point person? Like, I'm even thinking of, what is the Fleet Advisory Service role in educating the drivers and how it changes their job at all, if any?
Absolutely. I think workforce development is kind of an industry term that's being thrown around right now is really important when we're talking about transitioning to electric vehicles, just for the impact to everyone, right? Drivers, mechanics, anyone who might be interacting with the buses. We've even talked about with school districts, letting the administrators know what's going on because, oftentimes students are really interested to hear about the technology, but workforce development is becoming a really big kind of buzzword and something that CalSTART is really involved in working on, understanding high voltage training for, plugging the vehicles in, recognizing that you have less moving parts on electric vehicles, so you're not doing your oil changes anymore. There's a shift in what a mechanic's duty is going to be like. On a driver's side, what we're seeing and what we're hearing from drivers is that it's a better experience because it's a smoother ride, it's a quieter ride. They don't really notice much as far as driving being different, other than that you have a better power takeoff and things like that. But I think that there is a shift across anyone who interacts with the vehicles, and just understanding the positives and the changes that we're talking about is important.
All right, great. This is a question for DOT to follow up on your response to CAE 92. How has the Charge Pilot software been working? And can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like as our resident fleet operator?
So about a year and a after we put an RFP out for charge management software, went through a process. We selected Mobility House's Charge Pilot program. After initial startup, there was this physical hardware installation, which took place over the summer, and we've installed all charging management in all our facilities currently that are operational. The cost is somewhere about $7,500 per year for the 5-year program. It's a 5-year program we're looking at. So far, it's met or exceeded our expectations. We actually have a practical application in Hamden because one of the transformers is for various reasons not able to give us the full capacity, so we're able to throttle it down and cap that rate lower than to minimize that. We're also able to adjust with looking at time of day rates. We're able to manage the chargings at that level. So far we'd say it's very successful. We're planning on moving forward with that to fully deploy that. Not just also right now the pilot was plug-ins. We're moving towards an overhead pantograph model. So the intent, all our future garages will have the pantographs. They'll drive in, the pantographs will connect to the buses, and then the software will basically handle the charging to optimize it. We're going like roughly at a 50% model, in total capacity. But with charge management, we're optimistic we can get to 35% of the instantaneous, theoretical capacity. So far, so good. We're also, as I think I mentioned, we're also working with UI specifically on a smart grid application. We're having those discussions. We're trying to work out how their system would interact with our Mobility House, and we've had numerous meetings where we've discussed the logistics of that.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask you for some more information on that pilot and what you're kind of envisioning, and what's involved. And is this part of the Smarter Grid Solutions program at IES?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, we've had some preliminary, we're still in the discussion phase of how it would work, and we've been connecting with, there's some overlap in what it does and Mobility House does, but then we would lose, some control, at that scale, but we understand there is a capacity to go beyond. Hamden's about 20% capacity to go from 20 to 100. We understand there's some offsite. So we're hoping to use that as kind of a transition where we can, maximize our off-peak charging and optimize the transition time, because we recognize it's like a 3 to 5 year period as UI upgrades the offsite, power.
Oh, you're saying offsite from your.
Offsite at the
Okay,
substation,
at the
yeah.
substation.
Yes,
Got
at the
it.
substation,
Got it.
they'll determine how much money, how much power they send through to us. In conjunction, it's some level of control we would give up. But if there's only so much power, we recognize, we're not gonna get more power than we need.
Right.
So, yeah.
I'll just flag that UI's resident IES expert is sitting in the audience, so he's happy, I'm sure, to answer any questions that folks may have.
So the situation you just described, Brian, would that fall into the flexible interconnection category then, because you're managing against a grid constraint? From the categories you talked through earlier?
So I'm not, so Mike, if you wouldn't mind just sort of kind of briefly talking through what the Smarter Grid Solutions setup would do, and then I can answer the question, I think, a little bit more eloquently.
So Mike Crowley, Clean Energy Policy Manager at UI, and I think so. Am I just not talking into it? There we go. Okay. So yeah, so like super high level, not a technical person, but the Smarter Grid Solutions program is really kind of just to help defer some of the costs. Like we're still going to have to do upgrades, you know, in the long run, but yeah, I'd like to kind of defer any upgrades and allow a customer such as CT Transit to, you know, quicker and, you know, cheaper make the upgrades that they need internally to advance the EV program there. So very high level.
So flexible interconnection is, it's very responsive to dynamic grid conditions. So there are, so for example, like there's something called dispatch limiting schedules. And my understanding of the difference between that versus flexible interconnection is DLS is when it's determined at the time of the interconnection study what that customer can access from the grid and when. Flexible interconnection is really specific to what are the actual conditions happening on the system at that point in time, and it evolves on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not an expert on what the Smarter Grid Solution setup does. I don't think it's that sort of dynamic approach where it's really responding to what's actually happening on the grid at a given point in time.
I thought that Mr. Curtis said it was based on the capacity constraint at the substation.
At the level, so they know how much power they can send to, say 2 megawatts, I think in practical. So, we need 10 megawatts, so we know, but we can charge off peak. So we have some flexibility within the window of the off, UI's got an off peak rate. So we have some flexibility with that, that we can dial that in.
Yeah, and it could also be that, and I'm making up numbers, but perhaps the substation, maybe they can access 2 megawatts and they've got to stay below that versus flexible interconnection would be, at some times of the day, they might have that full capability to access that full 2 megawatts, but other times when there are constraints, and that could be potentially one of the differences. But again, I am not an expert on the Smarter Grid Solution software, so I can't really speak definitively to if it is actually sort of a flexible interconnection type of approach.
I said, we're still working through the pilot and, what it would look like in practice.
And now that we've called on Mr. Crowley, I do wonder if we could talk about the school bus V2G project.
Yeah.
Now that it was raised in the CAEs, any updates on how that's going?
So I should have an update on Thursday. But yeah, so we've run into some issues with the interconnection process, or not issues, but just kind of identifying who's responsible for what in terms of electrical drawings, things of that nature. So we're still working that out with the vendor. And our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday to kind of walk through the next steps and put together a realistic timeline, based on, the hurdles that we've kind of come up across the past 2 months or so. So still working on getting everything, in place, getting everything installed, and yeah, hopefully have some good news on Thursday.
Great.
Great.
Thank you. All right, now we're kind of shifting into more managed charging topics. So actually, quick question on the Charge Pilot software, would that fall under the load management pilot proposal?
So I think the Charge Pilot software is really focused around scheduling of the charging.
Okay.
So to Mr. Bond's point around a distinction between managed charging and scheduling charging, what we think of managed charging, it's the utility company developing programs to have some level of control over when, for example, EV charging stations are being charged. Scheduling of charging is helpful for a fleet because it can actually, across their fleet of vehicles, it can schedule and optimize that charging to, for example, take advantage of a rate solution. But they're two distinct things, and I think if I understand it correctly, that pilot is really focused on sort of the scheduling and optimization of the charging for the operator.
Okay, so neither UI, I mean, I know that's in both territories, but so at the Hamden Garage, UI is not involved in managing and directing the charging at all. It's all DOT.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
in our house. I mean, the other
Okay.
program would have UI have more control, but right now we have control. We're working with them, telling them, okay, we're going to charge, we've dialed it in, so we're going to charge at 75% of max between, 8 and 10, and we're not going to charge more than 20% during the day, that kind of thing. That's the kind of level of granularity, but, to optimize, because, we know there's a limit to offsite power, so we're not going to go beyond that. If that means it so.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful for my clarity. So then to kind of go back out to the whole broader group, as we talk more about managed charging specifically, what I'd really like to hear from all of you is kind of a discussion about like which options that the EDCs went through in terms of managed charging options should be included in the program eligibility, just in terms of what you've seen, being useful in other jurisdictions, and also in terms of program management and admin efforts.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So when you say managed charging options, are you referring to those load management solutions? Okay,
Yes, the load management solutions.
thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just offer the lack of people jumping in is probably because a lot of these, haven't been implemented on any kind of wide scale in either Connecticut or another jurisdiction. So it just highlights how nascent all of these things really are.
Maybe a better question is, are there any that absolutely shouldn't be included?
I guess one of the questions that I have when you're considering the options as opposed to the rates is what are the managed charging structures designed to incentivize that the rate doesn't already incentivize?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to the structure of the chart, when we're trying to identify like what's the primary purpose of any particular technology. So some of them are really designed to get you to be able to put in some kind of load that wouldn't otherwise be able to be put in because of the need for a distribution system upgrade. Versus a rate wouldn't really be designed to do that, right? The rate's just a reflection of the cost of the whatever load that you're taking off the system. If I did that right.
Yeah, I mean, the rate would include, like the scenario one rate design, for example, includes in its design pricing that reflects peak time usage, and that might incentivize. It's an economic incentive as opposed to controlled. There might be a period of time when there's higher costs on the system. And then if you bring on more load, and you might incur additional costs at that time, upgrades or whatever it might be, the pricing reflects that, but not quite the same as managed charging, which is very specific, targeted, and has very well-defined incentives.
Yeah, so that's correct about the difference between the rate and managed charging as a specific solution, but then managed charging isn't really designed either to address a system capacity constraint. That's more addressing system-wide capacity. Right.
I understand. So it's addressing, so the rates that you've proposed, they do incentivize load shifting, right? Charging during certain times rather than others. But the difference between the rate and the managed charging elements that you've presented is that the managed charging elements can provide more specific and targeted incentives for people to change their behavior, either
I think that's fair.
geographically or time specific.
Managed charging is, I think, more system level. Yeah.
Yeah, managed charging is more system level, whereas the other solutions are more site specific. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just thinking through from a fleet advisory service when we're trying to coach a district about how to set up their operating schedule of, you have to, it's better if you charge overnight, but if you install a V2G charger and you can discharge during this time, is that worth the additional cost of installing a V2G capable charger? It gets quite complicated. So I guess my preference would be for a streamlined and clear process, regardless of what the decision is.
Well, yeah, just to add, so I think that a lot of that's going to depend on the outcome of this proceeding. So if there's a incentive program that we establish and we're able to incentivize, for example, bi-directional chargers, I think having a decision is going to help to sort of focus our efforts around what we're actually trying to achieve. And then to the extent that we can build that into supporting you with your fleet advisory services, that I think that decision in August is going to, I think, go a long way to helping give some direction and insight to what that might look like.
Yeah, I don't know that this docket is the right place to discuss it, but I think as you're thinking about the collection of assets to the grid that can be flexibly managed to provide grid services, it's worth discussing that, for example, the energy storage solutions program that we co-manage with the utilities, and thinking about, how do we align the incentives and the structure across all of these different, regardless of what kind of equipment it is.
So to follow up on your point, Mr. Morris, as you're talking about, to have the clarity about the various load management programs, are there any, should all of them be, all of the ones you listed, should they all be included? Are they all, do we know enough to be able to winnow it down or have any kind of prescriptive determination? Or should it be, as you conduct fleet advisory services, incorporate all of these options into the offering? So not just for you, Mr. Morris, but kind of for the group.
I'll just say that, the purpose of, our response was more to sort of educate on the world of the possible. I don't think that we're necessarily saying that all those things could or should be included in an incentive program that results from this proceeding. But those are the things that we're aware of that are either happening in other jurisdictions at some level of scale or are being sort of considered. So it's, I think we're open to stakeholder feedback on what stakeholders would like to see, including Pura staff, and then we could work to determine the best way to incorporate those types of solutions into the potential program.
I'll further add that some of the, sorry, Mr. Brown. I was going to say some of the strategies that you identified here are customer side and some of them are grid side. So I think that for the ones that are customer side, namely looking at storage and storage plus generation and automated load management, that falls firmly within the FAS as you're providing them advice about what they need. I don't think that we need specific direction from the authority to provide that service. It's looking at, what is the best solution for, and what is the technology that's out there that can help deliver the best solution to the customer side. And to the utilities points regarding the variety of potential future elements that could be brought to it, I'm interested to see sort of where the technology takes us, but to the comments in the docket, I think it would be premature to require participation in the something like a flexible interconnection this time.
I also want to add that, while we haven't seen these solutions implemented in the medium and heavy duty space, we have seen them implemented in the light duty space, especially in, public charging, independent of a program, right? So a customer could be fully incentivized on their own to pursue one or more, some combination of these without a utility or other outside incentive, right? Because it just helps their business case to shift load because of rate, or it helps them to install a configuration that's helpful for their business, that's overall more cost effective for them.
So to follow up on that question or on that comment, can we discuss whether there should be incentives tied to these load management technologies at all, or if it's not really needed because the market incentivizes it? And I don't know if we might not know that answer yet either.
I refer back to my earlier statements where, the Green Bank's position is that if we are if we have a fleet of equipment across the grid, including storage, including, these vehicles, it makes sense to align as much as possible the various programs that people can register for, to provide sort of a more uniform benefit or incentive for people that are able to participate in providing grid services.
I believe my colleague, Mr. Rosa, has some comments to make up at the podium.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, Rick Rosa. I am the manager of EV products and programs at UI. So just want to clarify that when we talk about managed charging, it's very important that the way that we think about managed charging right now has really only been experienced through the lens of the light duty programs and 1712 REO4 and preceding program review dockets. And we've come to view managed charging as a utility activity where we work with our end use customers to either encourage behavior, we have for them to modify their charging patterns to off-peak periods, or the utilities actually control the load. And, thanks to, the program review dockets and proceeding input from stakeholders and PURA, we've looked to extend that into light duty fleets. And, I think we've been very clear in this docket that our experience in REO4 and proceeding program review dockets is taking that type of technology that we are able to leverage at a residential level and taking it into a fleet level, even at a light duty level, is very difficult because the technology really is just not there in terms of being able to integrate with those platforms through the types of platforms we use today. And similar to my colleague, Mr. Moniz from Eversource, who came up earlier and mentioned on how we are implementing demand response with light duty fleets, because that's really the only opportunity we have to interact with these fleets right now and we get the data from that, as my colleague stated, after the fact. We get the data from the actual EVSE. We look at when they charged, and we see if they met the demand response. And in this docket, we've continually expressed to the authority that, that the opportunity for us to manage charging at a light duty level has been very difficult, and taking it to the scale of, like my colleague at Connecticut Transit is talking about scheduling and all of these things, and then the operations of electric school bus fleets. And, it gets very, very complicated very, very fast. And to, have the utility think about managing load across all these very unique use cases and all these different operational needs. Everyone is specific and unique. Very difficult to implement something like that, which is why we've advocated in this docket for behind the meter on-site technologies like energy storage, like automated load management systems, like whether that could be software or hardware, to enable, whether through a fleet assessment service or through shared business operations, understand and be able to implement those technologies by the people who understand the business the best, and also know where to best incorporate those technologies within their business operations. That's all I wanted to say. Unless anybody has any questions, I'll follow up on it.
Actually, Mr. Rosa, I think I might have one question, and I don't know if it's you or someone else, but is the pilot that you proposed different from the New York load management pilot program or not?
Right. So we responded to that, and I forget which interrogatory it was, but no, it's really not. We're proposing it as it's been as it's been, we've laid it out, implemented in New York. And, you know, we just started that in October. So we have a lot of interest in energy storage systems. There's a lot of organizations out there that, or entities, I should say, that are, right now working and developing integrated battery storage and EVSE solutions. We've got a lot of interest. We have, I think, probably, 10 to 12 different projects proposed in our affiliate utilities there in New York that incorporate battery storage and EVSE, and then a lot of interest in automated load management software built into the EVSE. So we're working through a lot of those applications right now. So sorry, I don't have anything to report, but the short answer is yes, it's based on that program.
And just, do you have a number of how many applications roughly?
Yeah, so we
Just in
have
terms of
12 projects proposed for EV and energy storage, hybrid solutions, I guess I would say. They're developed to work in tangent to one another. And then we have, I think, 20 to 30 applications already for, subject to check, for automated load management system built into EVSE.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think I'll just, if it's okay, just to get back to the question that you were starting to scratch at, which is, should there be any, within the context of a program, should there be incentives for any of the suite of solutions that we outlined in the presentation? And I think that I think we've alluded to it before in our written comments, but it depends on what the structure of the infrastructure incentive is. And which is why we are kind of advocated for a cap. So the point is, if utility side costs are 100% covered up, up to no amount, then it doesn't matter, right? The customers, they don't care about trying to lower costs through some load management solution. So offering incentives for it would be silly. So we would have to work on the design of the incentive and that's why based on the average configuration of a medium heavy duty fleet, of which that there is no such thing, but a theoretical average, the cap we proposed, the site cap we proposed, I think would address the majority of sites who would need a significant distribution system upgrade. $3 million isn't going to cover that and the infrastructure and everything. So that then they would be incentivized to pursue some of these other solutions. So that's sort of getting at what your question was asking, I think. It's sort of, so the answer is it depends on.
It depends. Yeah.
It depends on how we set this up. Yeah.
And I would also just clarify again that our proposal wouldn't be to include these solutions as part of the broader offering. It'd be at a pilot scale. So there's a difference between what any fleet customer within the primary use cases could access versus a subset of those customers that could be good potential customers to enroll in one of these pilot programs.
And one last caveat is that, and I think we've said this before, at some point, it doesn't matter how many of these solutions you employ on any given circuit, that circuit's going to need a distribution system upgrade, right? So you may be able to get a fleet in under a solution, but then fleet 2 or 3 comes in and, we are.
Right.
One more comment here, in following up on my colleague, Mr. Morris's comments about the pilot. The reason that we've proposed it as a pilot, and I'm sure you've seen with the interrogatory responses, it is a program in New York. It's a program that's available to any commercial EVSE charging infrastructure. So we thought that use case was an ideal opportunity for us to then say, let's take this idea that we think is a really good idea and use it as a pilot opportunity specifically for medium heavy duty use cases. So I just wanted to clarify why we're proposing as a pilot when it's a program in New York.
That's very helpful. Okay. Any other thoughts on this?
On the discussion of the innovation opportunities and incentives, I'm just curious to hear from the EDCs about how any potential vehicle to grid revenues would potentially be calculated, whether it would be at all tethered to the scenario one rate or as separate net metering rate or individually negotiated with the fleet operator. Just as we start to field questions about V2G opportunities in Connecticut, what we can, kind of pass along on your behalf.
I would just say that I think, as is the case with a lot of these sort of topics, we're open to stakeholder feedback. We haven't actually started to put pen to paper on what a V2G or any of these pilots could look like, really down to the nitty-gritty details. So open to stakeholder feedback on what you think would be impactful for something like that.
Got it. Yeah, I think we're happy to have those conversations, and I'll just underscore that I think we view Zoom and First Student as potential strong participants in a V2G pilot, whether that's through this docket or through the IES program down the line.
Okay. I have a question for Deep to follow up on CAE 80 about any updates with any projects that are being developed using the federal charging and fueling infrastructure discretionary grant program and any climate pollution reduction grant projects.
In just the medium heavy duty space or overall? So there's
Both, if you could do it quick.
Sure thing. So in the light duty space, Deep was awarded a CFI Clean Fuels Infrastructure Grant from FHWA to the tune of about $14.6 million. And that's to cover about 100 fast chargers and about a dozen level 2 chargers in 7 different communities throughout Connecticut. We're working with FHWA to implement that grant. We're looking at doing that in a 2-stage process. We're going to first contract with an administrator that's going to help us sort of flesh out the program, and then another contract for someone to go and implement the entire grant in the 7 different communities. Can give you the details on the communities and number of chargers if you want. And then in the medium and heavy duty space, Connecticut is part of a 4-state winning bid under the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, CPRG. That's looking to do essentially a medium heavy duty charging corridor up 95 from, say, DC area up through Connecticut. So it's New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and Connecticut are the 4 states that were awarded that. Connecticut's portion of that grant is about $56 million to construct 3 or 4, up to 6. We'll say 4 to 6, but 4. Medium heavy duty charging stations along the I-95, I-84 corridor. Anything designated as clean fuels fleet corridor is going to be fair game in there. Could be large, could be up to 1 megawatt chargers.
And do you have and just in terms of time, like what's the timeline look for those projects?
To say that there is uncertainty interjected into the process is woefully inadequate in your statement. Best case.
There is an outline. So 2025, for the most part, is bringing on a project-wide coordinator or contractor through all of the states that would help to coordinate that. And then there is a 2-stage process for the projects. One starting in January 2026, where we would issue at a state level some RFP for those initial sites, and then a second one for the second half of the sites. And it could be 1 and 3, it could be 2 and 4, something like that. So that process would start in 2026, January, and the next process, the second phase of that would be 2027.
Okay.
That's for the CPRG.
That's for CPRG.
Okay. So a long time in the future.
Not
that long.
Not that long.
No, we need to consider how much work needs to be done. For CFI, looking at bringing a contractor on board this year. For FHWA's perspective, I think we need to have those chargers in the ground by the end of 26.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, and then what kind of collaboration or coordination is happening with the EDCs in terms of selecting those sites and the grid needs that we've been talking about?
That planning is anticipated this year.
Okay,
After we bring on in the.
okay,
For the medium and heavy duty space,
For the
there's,
medium and
there's a national grid study that's underway that's going to help identify, yeah, prioritize sites.
okay,
And I know Eversource is participating in that project as well. Yep.
okay. All right, any other thoughts on that? And now I know we have a couple minutes before our agenda says we're going to move to public comment. So while we've got all our stakeholders here, I'd really like to touch on, 'cause we've talked about having a third-party administrator potentially, and we've involved the Green Bank in administering fleet advisory services. But I'd love to hear from stakeholders on what the required qualifications of a third-party administrator, or what are the required qualifications of a program administrator would be needed to make this program successful?
So I think part of it depends on what is the program that we're talking about. So is it a rebate program for customers? Is it a fleet advisory services program? Is it a managed charging program? So I think that answer, has an impact on who would be best qualified to administer any one component of a program. So I think we've indicated jointly that, for fleet advisory services, we're open to Green Bank being the administrator, because the reality is that even if the utility companies were jointly administering that program, we would be outsourcing to a knowledgeable third party to be able to do that on our behalf. So as long as our customers get access to those services, and as long as we get access to the data that we discussed was important for planning, I think we're agnostic to whether it's us that's administering it or if it's somebody like Green Bank administering that program or others. Yeah. And then I'll just also continue along. So the reality too is that whether it's an infrastructure incentive program or a managed charging program, even in the case where we are the administrators, we do work with a lot of partners to enable a lot of these solutions. So for managed charging, we have multiple software, partners that we work with to be able to enable that. In the case of infrastructure incentives, we have, rebate administration partners that we work with. So, we're seen as sort of the administrator, but we do work with other folks that have the experience and have the efficiencies built in to be able to do that. I would also say that, we do like to leverage sort of our, we do have the customer relationships and we work with our customers very closely. So I think that it's helpful to have us as sort of, similar to how we do it in the light duty program. We're jointly administering the program, working with those partners. I think that model makes sense, but, open to suggestions. Once again, Mr. Rosa.
Just to follow up on my colleague, Mr. Morris's comment. So, yeah, I think from our perspective that I think some of the other stakeholders across the table here, and we do have a broad cross-section of stakeholders, might recognize that I think it's pretty widely recognized that we talk a lot about, managed charging or some of these other technologies, load management. We like to refer to it as vehicle to grid integration. And so we view, and I'm speaking, for UI and perhaps our colleagues at Eversource, but we view vehicle to grid integrations as a future, if not now, a future core competency of the utilities. I mean, I think the authority has been clear that electrification of transportation will be a core competency of the EDCs in the future. And so we see ourselves as being kind of a key stakeholder in ensuring, just think about the number of conversations and different types of holder conversations we've had today about flexible interconnection, load management, managed charging, all of these things, kind of all, taking vehicle electrification transportation and ensuring that we integrate that load into the grid, whether it's one dimensional in terms of taking load from the grid or bidirectional, right? And so we see ourselves as the key stakeholders to ensure that we are doing the best that we can to integrate load that comes from transportation electrification into distribution system planning, into distribution system operations, and delivering reliable and safe service for our customers. So I think we view that as our space. And then I'll stop there.
Alex, self-serving. I wasn't going to speak up, as CalStart is a company that provides third-party services. In light of those comments, I think it's very important that the utility is involved at every step of planning, but I don't necessarily think it's in the best interest of the customer to have the utility be in control of any kind of fleet advisory service program. I think that it's going to take a village, and it's making sure that all of the stakeholders are in the room, and that there's non-biased information that's being provided to the end user so that they can make an informed decision that benefits them and their operation.
Great. Any last thoughts from stakeholders while we're here?
Particularly on whether there are any issues that were not addressed during today's discussion that anyone would like to raise. Okay. Hearing none, I will open the floor now to offer public comment. If you would like to provide public comment, please approach the podium back there and state your name and affiliation. Okay. I would like to, at this point, just as a final opportunity, offer the stakeholders a chance for any closing statements for today's meeting. No obligation to, but if you would like to, we can start on this side of the room if there's any closing statements from participants today on today's discussion. Feel free to just pass it down if you have any.
I just want to thank the authority for hosting today's session. I appreciated the chance to talk through in person some of the key elements of this program, and the questions that the authority brought and the discussion that our colleagues hosted was very fruitful, I thought. Thank you.
I'll second that. Thank you very much for the opportunity today.
I'll third that. Go one step further and just say the one thing that we didn't really talk on from my chair here is the air quality benefit associated with electric vehicles and the nature of really what we're driving at by making this transition to decarbonized transportation. And we're looking at the largest source of air pollution in Connecticut, bar none. Stationary, there's no power plant that puts out as much air pollution as the combined sector of both medium heavy duty and light duty vehicles. So it's an imperative from a public health perspective. It's imperative from the perspective of needing to meet our GHG targets as a state, and meeting federal health-based air quality standards for where people are most impacted. So this is part of a longer transition. Great to have the conversation, and we're really happy to be here and be participating through this. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely want to second that, and to thank the authority for all the work on this, as well as everyone here today. Just building on the prior comment, especially in the medium and heavy duty space, there are environmental justice communities that are more impacted by those vehicles. So a reminder that, part of those air pollution issues, those are disproportionately borne by environmental justice communities, and this process has the potential to really alleviate and provide huge benefits, especially to those overburdened communities. Going forward, Sierra Club wants to emphasize the potential for load management here, and make sure that conversation that we've begun today continues. Because integrating these vehicles into the grid is a really huge challenge and a critical component to figure out how to manage that load. And lastly, I mentioned it briefly, but the sort of advanced planning for the grid to make sure these chargers can come online in a reasonable amount of time and not be very delayed is something we want to continue talking about. Thanks.
I'll just say thank you, and this was a very helpful discussion.
I want to thank you for having these meeting in person, so I actually get to be in the same room with many of the people I've talked to over the last 2.5 years. We're very excited about getting these rates put in place. It's been a great opportunity, so we're looking forward to it. As we said in our response, the rate structure works for us right now. We've locked in a 4-year generation rate to understand it at a relatively low cost for us. So we're very optimistic that these are going to work, and we're looking to get to 20% of our fleet, in the very short time. We're at 10%, and we're hoping to get to 20% probably in the next 18 months. So there is some make-ready costs and off-site improvements we make, but we're working closely with our EDCs to solve those. So thank you.
So all 7th or 8th, thank you to the authority. Also, thank you to the stakeholders. I think we've reiterated numerous times our willingness to sort of take stakeholder feedback and incorporate it into wherever this takes us. So thank you all for joining and for the conversation.
Yep, thanks to everyone. Obviously, I think this session highlighted that's still a very complex and nascent space. So I appreciate the continued opportunity to both educate and be educated by all the stakeholders here, and it's great to be back in New Britain.
I guess I'm anchoring. I would like to see more concrete guidance. And we talked about collaboration. We talked about information to be reported, data needs, and there's an awful lot of material here to cover. So I guess I'm keeping an eye out for what the next sort of directive and sort of structure timing wise is and the kinds of things we want to focus on. So that's my comment.
Thank you, everyone. So as we stated today, the goal of this meeting was to try and identify any additional or further discussion points that needed further discovery before the briefs are due in April. So you can keep an eye out for another set of interrogatories in the near future. Thank you, Laura. Yes, as a final reminder, briefs are due on April 21st and reply briefs on May 7th. We plan to issue a proposed final decision on July 9th with the regular meeting scheduled for August 13th for the final decision. And we appreciate everyone's time today and for coming in person. Thankfully, the snow did not happen this morning. And I think with that, we can adjourn. Thank you, everyone.